It was a rainy night and I was driving home from my shift at the late-night diner I work at. It was a quiet shift at work. I had a weird amount of energy still, so I knew I was going to have to pop a melatonin when I got home. I was driving my usual route, a scenic road during the day but majorly dark at night, lacking many light posts. There are occasional little parking lots with cute little strips of stores or family-owned restaurants and shops, and then just stretches of nothingness. And by nothingness, I mean forest. I was passing one of the aforementioned parking lots of a well-known deli, and under a light post was a woman standing out in the rain with her arm held out. She was waving me down. I slowed as I realized it was a slightly older woman who appeared to be in her 50s, maybe. This woman was really tall, like 5 feet 11 inches or 6 feet, but very skinny. I lowered my window and yelled, "Do you need a ride?" She came over to the front door and opened it, chanting how much of a hero I am. I asked where she was heading, and she said just up the road to town. She was soaking wet, getting my car all wet, but I like to think of myself as a good person and I couldn't, in good conscience, leave another woman out there in the cold rain. However, picking up a random man on the other hand would be a different story. The woman seemed sweet, but I noticed as I looked at her while talking to her that she was missing a few teeth, very, very off-putting. I had to now wonder if she were homeless. She didn't smell or look like a homeless person, though, but the rain soaking her and her clothes could have been masking any scent temporarily. Plus, her hair was so wet that what may have usually been scraggly undone hair could now have been weighted down and straightened by the water. Either way, the woman was smiling the whole time and didn't seem like a threat. We pulled up to an intersection with a gas station on one corner. I pulled in next to a pump, might as well fill up. I asked her if she wanted anything from inside. I was really doing my good deed for the week. She said, "No thanks, honey," so I went inside to pay the attendant for gas and some spiked seltzers since tomorrow was the weekend. When I got back to my car, the woman was gone. I looked around the gas station lot real quick, but it was tiny, she was gone. She must have run off somewhere. I felt slightly bad, feeling like she was some lost helpless woman, but part of me also felt slightly relieved. I filled up the tank of my SUV and was on my way home. When I got back to the house, I went straight inside my apartment, which is the first level of a two-family house. There's a tenant upstairs and me. The front door into the foyer was usually left unlocked, then the 2 doors leading to each apartment were locked. I let myself in out of the rain and into my apartment. I set the seltzers down on the counter. I wasn't that tired yet, so I took a melatonin and tried to go to bed. Even with the melatonin, though, I was having a hard time sleeping that night. My mind was kind of going wild with thoughts, a lot of thinking about that woman I picked up earlier and what happened to her. At certain points, I heard slight sounds from outside of my bedroom, but I dismissed them as sounds from the upstairs tenant. Boy, do I wish I had been more suspicious before falling asleep. I woke up in my dark bedroom, something that usually would never happen when I take a melatonin. I usually sleep like a baby through the night. I sat up, feeling drowsy and really thirsty too. I reached over the table next to my bed for my water, and then I saw and heard something across the room from me. I saw someone crouched in the corner of my bedroom behind a clothing dresser, with their legs folded. I had to be hallucinating it. I shook my head violently and made weird noises. I even slapped myself in the face, and now whoever was in the corner stood up and walked out of the room. I didn't scream, I didn't say a word. I sat in my bed in literal shock. The part that had me questioning my sanity for a bit after the figure was gone was that there wasn't a single sound from outside the room after this. No footsteps, not the sound of a door closing. I grabbed my phone and called my dad. He picked up, confused why I was calling so late. I told him what I just saw, and he said, "Carter, you probably just had a night terror." I stayed on the phone with him as I was continuing to become more awake. I left my room and turned on the lights to the living room outside. It was a small space, there was no one in there. I looked around the entire space and could confirm no one was there. I started to believe that maybe I did just hallucinate it, but still, I slept with the bedroom door locked that night. When I woke up in the morning, I drank some coffee and got dressed for the gym. I went to open the door to the foyer and realized it was already unlocked. My heart sank. Last night, what I saw, was it real? I did another look around the apartment, confirming no one was inside. I went out to my car and opened the back door to put my gym bag in the back seat, and that's when I noticed the damp yellow-brownish stains all over the floor in the back, and my blanket that I always had back there was gone. I wanted to cry or scream. I figured it out. That woman snuck into the back seat last night when I was in the gas station. She either somehow unlocked the door to my apartment, or I mistakenly left it unlocked. I called my dad again, frantically asking him what to do. He said, check and make sure nothing was stolen, and if nothing was, then calling the police really wouldn't do anything. I checked the house and didn't find anything to be missing, just my blanket from the car. I skipped the gym that day. In fact, I stayed bottled up in my apartment for a while after that. I was just genuinely disturbed. I didn't want to live there for much longer after that, and so after that month, I found a new place to live. This happened a few months ago, and I don't know why I agreed, but I decided to go with my friend Elias to a house party he was attending during our first year of high school, even though I wasn't even invited. Elias was able to pull some strings, and I accepted the invitation knowing that I wouldn't be able to drive. I made the choice to go with Elias. When we arrived at the home late at night, Elias told me to leave my phone in the car. He explained that maybe I could lose it or someone I don't know could try and take it from me while I'm not looking. At first, I was confused. I simply nodded, and we got out of the car. I went with Elias into the home's backyard where the party was taking place. I glanced around the backyard and saw people engaging in various activities such as smoking, drinking, and possibly even doing drugs in small groups. Elias had encouraged me to go mingle and say hello to a few people. After a few hours, I realized I had had way too much to drink because my vision was completely foggy. After getting closer to the house, I leaned against the wall to support myself. As I did so, I noticed the time on my watch indicated that it was either midnight or 1:30 in the morning. I knew it was time to leave, so I set out to find Elias. Despite my overwhelming need to collapse, I scanned the yard for him, but I was unable to locate him or see him. When I asked a few others if they'd seen Elias, they all said they had not. I decided to call Henry to find out where he was, so I reached inside my pocket to feel for my phone, but it wasn't there. I cursed myself in the back of my mind because I realized that I had left my phone in Elias's car. It had disappeared with him. I realized there was only one way to get home, which was walking. I remembered my house wasn't too far from this house, but the night was chilly because it was fall. I thought about just asking someone else to take me home, but I didn't know anyone else who could help, so I stuck with my idea of walking home in the darkness by myself. I then got to the road and started stumbling down the street. I knew I had too many drinks because I felt lightheaded and dizzy. A few minutes later, I made it to the main area of the street and kept walking. I lazily started thinking about a bunch of different things, like why did Elias decide to leave me alone at the party, or why I decided to listen to Elias's idiotic idea of leaving my phone in his car so I couldn't call him or anyone else. I started cursing myself for being so careless with my drinking and even getting drunk when I knew I shouldn't have done that. I stopped walking on the side of the road because I was getting tired and crossed my arms over my chest tightly to keep myself warm. Then I remembered something I could do, which was hitchhiking. I held out my arm and stuck out my thumb, hoping someone could see me. I watched as a couple of cars drove past me. They wouldn't stop. As minutes ticked by, I started feeling uneasy, thinking I would have to start walking again. It was past 1 o'clock in the morning, and there were a few cars driving past me, but no one was stopping because they either didn't notice me or didn't care. I hesitated and thought about walking home again, but I realized that in my drunken state, it would be too daunting. I was still holding out my thumb when a gray truck pulled up and stopped in front of me. I smiled as I stumbled towards the vehicle. The window rolled down, and an older-looking man with a beard asked me if I needed a ride. I told him yes, and then told him where my house was before getting into the truck, feeling grateful for the ride. As we started driving down the road, the man began trying to make small talk with me, asking what happened to me. However, I was too disoriented to have an actual conversation with him, and the only things I could manage to say were low mumbling or just murmurs and groans. As we turned the corner onto my street away from the party, I started feeling uneasy for some reason. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was strange about this man. Suddenly, we drove past my house, and I told the man that we had just driven past it. I felt my gut telling me to get out, but I couldn't because I was too drunk to move. I was about to tell the man to let me out before we got too far away from my house when suddenly the man turned to me, and I noticed he had a sinister look on his face. "You know you shouldn't be drunk while you're hitchhiking because you'd make a very easy target," the man said, smirking darkly. The man reached over and started rubbing my leg. I didn't know what he was trying to do, but I knew it probably wasn't anything good. But before he could do anything else to me, we both heard a loud siren behind the car, and then a flashing red and blue light flooded the night. I realized it was the police, and I jumped for joy inside. The man panicked and stopped, unlocking the doors, which allowed me to jump out of the car. I ran as fast as I could, and the police officer rushed over to me. I told him the entire story about what happened to me. Unfortunately, nothing illegal happened per se at that point. The police officer told me that he was looking for someone in a gray truck who had apparently stolen something from a store. I'm not sure if it was the man who picked me up or someone else, but I was just glad the police officer stopped the car. A cop gave me a ride home, and I decided from then on I wouldn't get so drunk that I couldn't think straight. I now know the importance of being responsible and staying aware of my surroundings, even when having a good time. Around 8 years ago, I moved out of my mom's house into my first apartment in the city of Chicago. The place was a nice 3-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city in a friendly neighborhood by the University of Illinois. I lived with 2 roommates, Patrick and Kelsey. Kelsey was a good friend of mine, while Patrick was a good friend of Kelsey's who I had not met prior, although we ended up getting along just fine. One night, about a month after moving in, I met up with a few friends of mine for drinks at a bar more in the center of the city, around 15 minutes from my place. It was a good time, and I ended up getting slightly drunk before getting into a cab at 1 a.m. and heading home. Upon walking into my apartment, I noticed that Patrick's door was open, showing that he was staying at his girlfriend's place, while Kelsey's door was closed with the light from his TV shining underneath the crack. I made my way to my bedroom and put on my own TV before lying down to prepare for sleep. After around 10 minutes, I heard my doorbell ring. Half asleep, I woke up, confused as it was 1:30 in the morning, so I ignored it. A few seconds later, the doorbell rang again, and then again a few seconds after that. It's important to mention that my roommate Kelsey had a good amount of side cash by dealing weed to a few people. He was also a huge stoner himself, so the idea that he fell asleep while waiting for a late-night customer to come over was not out of the realm of possibility. With this in mind, I went over to my intercom and asked who was there. A girl's voice answered back, "It's Kaylee. I'm here to see Kelsey." Thinking that my suspicions had been confirmed, I exited out of my front door and headed down the stairs. The door to the outside of our apartment building was made of tall glass, so you could easily identify any potential visitors. Here, I saw an attractive college-age blonde girl with glasses waiting patiently outside. I had never seen this person before, however, she appeared to be non-threatening. Besides having random customers over to grab weed, Kelsey would also have some random girls over to hook up with from time to time. Because of this, I let my guard down slightly and cracked the door open. The girl then repeated what she had said moments earlier over the intercom, "Hi, I'm here to see Kelsey." I replied, "Okay, he's here. Just follow me up," and I held the door open for her. She grabbed the handle, and I turned around to head back up the stairs. As I was walking back up, I quickly noticed that this Kaylee girl was not following me up. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that she was still standing outside holding the door open, only now she was staring off to her right, almost as if waiting for someone. At this moment, a tidal wave of fear crashed over me as I realized something horrible was more than likely about to happen. I continued walking up to my place, quicker now. After turning the corner of the stairs, I heard the door swing open and then heavy footsteps running up the stairs behind me. I looked over my shoulder again, and what I saw shook me to my core. A tall, gangly man with sunken-in eyes and greasy long hair down to his shoulders was running up the stairs straight at me. He was wearing a sleeveless black t-shirt, and apart from the cheap-looking tribal tattoos I saw creeping up his arms, I noticed he was also holding what looked like a lead pipe in his right hand. At this moment, my body shot full of adrenaline as I turned around and raced back up the stairs and into my apartment. I turned around to close the door and saw the man, who was now only a few feet from entering my apartment, the pipe over his head. With less than a second to spare, I slammed the door and locked it in one swift motion. Immediately after, I heard the thud of the pipe hit my door. I stood facing the now closed door, paralyzed, as the man hit the door 3 more times while shouting obscenities at me. He eventually gave up and ran down the stairs and out the front door. I ran into Kelsey's room to wake him up. After telling him what exactly had just gone down, he responded by telling me that, yes, he knew a blonde girl named Kaylee, only he had just met her earlier the same day. Apparently, while I was out with my friends, the doorbell rang while Kelsey was home alone. Instead of going down to let her in himself, Kelsey buzzed her up after just hearing her name, thinking she was a friend of mine. When she reached the door to our unit, he opened it and let her in. He said it seemed like she was confused, mentioning that she was looking for someone named Felix. Kelsey responded by saying his own name and that no one named Felix lived here. He mentioned she stayed near the entrance of the unit and kept reaching behind her to make sure the door stayed open before leaving only a few moments later. After hearing this, My theory is that these same people came earlier in the day and, not expecting to have someone just let them up through the buzzer, the girl made the mistake of forgetting to keep the door to the building open, rendering the attacker unable to enter during this first attempt. Either way, we both got extremely lucky that night. We did call the police, who arrived and asked for more information about what happened. They asked if there was anyone we knew who might want to do us harm, and we answered no, which was the truth, as this seemed to be a completely random attack. The cops left soon after, saying that there was nothing much they could do. We never saw that Kaylee girl or her scumbag partner again. My family and I used to go camping all the time, sometimes more than 3 or 4 times a year, even. We were camping in White Mountain National Forest, and it was our first time doing a more primitive type of camp. Usually, we went to traditional campsites like Yogi Bear Jellystone or even KOA, but this time we were in for something different. I wasn't that excited for it because I didn't think it would be as fun. I think I was 14 when this happened, around that age at least. I was still in an angsty teenage phase, if you will. I was still a good kid, just a little emotional and rough around the edges. When we got there, while my parents were setting up, my little brother and I wanted to do some exploring. We walked around for a while, but we didn't go too far as we didn't know the area and we didn't want to get lost or stray too far from camp. We talked about anything you would imagine 2 unsupervised children would talk about. I started messing with my little brother, Blair, saying things like we were lost and to watch out for the bears and the monsters. Pretty crappy, I know, but I thought it was funny. We messed with each other like that all the time, but I could tell he was actually starting to get scared, so I let him know I was only joking. I was hoping to find a cool bank offshore, like a place we could swim or fish. I found the perfect spot. He ran over to it to investigate it, and I fell in love with the scenery. It truly was beautiful. Our little kid brains loved every second of the outdoors. I knew we had been gone a while, though, and I was in charge of my brother, and I didn't want us to get in trouble. Mom wanted us back before dark anyway, and we were starting to lose daylight. So, we walked back to camp, had dinner, and did our nightly ritual with the family, like playing board games. We had a campfire and all that fun stuff until eventually, it was time for bed. Blair and I were staying in our own tent, while our mom and dad had their own as well. We got our sleeping bags, a lantern, and not much of anything else, maybe some snacks that we snuck into our tent and a DVD player to watch a movie. I fell asleep, but I remember waking up for seemingly no reason in a groggy state of mind. I turned over towards Blair and noticed he was gone. I instantly shot up. I walked out of the tent and saw him walking towards the trail that we came from earlier. "Blair, what are you doing?" I asked. "Get back to sleep before Dad finds out what you're doing." That was when I heard a noise coming from my parents' tent. I worried that I woke them up by basically yelling. I don't know how Blair got out of the tent without me noticing in the first place, but he kept walking until eventually, he was out of my sight. I ended up finding him off the trail a ways, thanks to my lantern, and he was sitting by the lake. I grabbed him by the arm and yanked him towards camp when all of a sudden, we saw a shadow. It was a man, and there was something really wrong with him. Like, seriously. He wasn't only just being a creep by staring at us, but he was clearly deranged. He was standing in the moonlight, and I could see him semi-clearly. He had long, dark hair that looked greasy and a creepy mustache. He also had some sort of tool in his hand that looked like a hammer. The way he was just standing there, all crusty looking and staring intensely, showed me enough. He was just sitting there, mouth breathing, and he was extremely pale. He looked like he hadn't showered in weeks. I didn't stay for another second or even bother to say a word to him. I mean, come on, I was pretty sure he was a murderer. Now the chase was on. Blair wasn't as fast as me and he could barely keep up. Keep in mind, he was only 9 or 10, so his little legs could only go so fast. I grabbed his arm and practically dragged him to make him go faster. The other problem that we had was we had to get past this man to get back to camp, so we legit had to make a detour and run in a circle around him. I don't know what we would have done if it wasn't dark or if we weren't already close to home. We were pretty sure that we lost him and eventually met up with Mom and Dad. They found us out a ways from camp. I guess we were heading in the wrong direction. We kind of got lost in the panic, I guess. You'll never guess what happened after that. When we arrived back at camp, my dad's truck was gone, the only vehicle that we had out there. That man baited us off camp and he stole the truck, broke into our tents, and stole my dad's wallet and phone. Luckily, we had a walkie-talkie to call for help. The police found my dad's truck and actually arrested the man a few days later. What if we would have been out further into the woods that night? That man would have been out further into the woods that night. That man would have caught us, no doubt about it. He chased us through the woods and tried to murder us or kidnap us, one of the two. When my dad got the truck back, unfortunately, it was totaled in a drunk driving incident by the man that stole it. Man, that trip was a nightmare. It's all too hard to say, but I've been thinking about it non-stop for a while now, and I'm still paranoid. This happened in August of last year. I had taken a week off from work for a staycation at home. I had been living alone for the past few months after my roommate moved out, but I'd been working too much to really enjoy the space and freedom of living alone. This week was supposed to be my relaxing, me time that I never got to have. Unfortunately, it could not have been further from that. It was my second day off, and I was just chilling, watching TV, eating nice home-cooked meals, all of that kind of stuff, when I heard someone walk up to my front porch. It was midday, so I thought maybe the mailman or just some solicitor. But as I stayed sitting on the couch for a few minutes, I realized they still hadn't knocked or rang the doorbell. I never heard them walk away, so it got me curious. I got up and went over to the door to look out the peephole. Sure enough, someone was still on my porch. It was a man looking to be in his mid-30s, wearing a light sweatshirt and black jeans. He wasn't in front of the door, though. He was off to the side, looking around like he was searching for something. I thought of opening the door, but I was too nervous to confront him, so I just watched. After 40 seconds, the guy walked away quickly and got into a parked car on the road by my neighbor's house. Once I saw him drive away, I went out to investigate. Everything looked normal to me, at least everything in the area the man was looking around. I went back inside and mostly forgot about it. Within the hour, I took a nap, then made dinner a few hours later, and finally turned on a movie to finish off the night with. Sometime in the middle of it, there was a knock at the door. I paused the movie and went to see who it was. It was that man from earlier, this time standing in front of the door and seeming to be waiting for me to answer. I cracked the door open just enough to talk through. "Hey, I was hoping you'd help me out with something." I'd ask someone else, but nobody would answer, the man said right away with a big smile. "What do you need?" I asked. He went on to tell me this elaborate story about his car. Breaking down right next to my house, he pointed at it, and I immediately knew it was the same car I saw him drive away in earlier. Then he said all he needed was to use my phone to make a quick call. Knowing this was some sort of scam or something, I denied him right away and closed the door. I then looked through the peephole to make sure he left, but he didn't. His face grew excessively angry, and he banged on the door again. I yelled through the door that I'd call the cops if he didn't leave. He stood and thought for a moment, then hurried off, but not to his car. He walked around to the left side of the house. Fearing this was going to escalate, I dialed 911 and told them about the situation. Thank God I did, because not even a minute later, a sudden crash came from the dining room. I ran over to see what it was and saw that he'd smashed the window and was crawling through it. I tried to run for the garage to get in my car, but the man was quick, chasing me down half the house before grabbing me and holding me still. I fought back, kicking and punching, but he completely overpowered me. He told me through his clenched jaw to be quiet and insisted that I stop fighting while he dragged me to the front door and opened it. Once I knew what he was doing, I only started fighting harder. As he tried to bring me closer to his car, someone walking their dog on the other side of the road saw us and came running over. Before he even reached us, the man let go of me and sprinted to his car and drove away. It all happened so fast. Once the police arrived, they helped calm me down and got all the information I could give them. Apparently, it wasn't enough, though. He was never found. What's creepier is that the police think the first time I saw him come by wasn't actually his first time. They think I may have caught him collecting some sort of camera or mic he'd set up on my house to spy on me. He hasn't been back that I know of, but I plan to move out anyway just to be safe. Whatever his plan was, I don't want to risk finding out. Nowadays, I don't camp nearly as much as I used to. I'm 24, and ever since I was young, I've been into hiking. Now, I get hiking isn't all that appealing to most people, but because of where I live, it's pretty easy to get into. You don't have to travel all that far for a pretty stunning scenic view. I try to find a new trail to hike every weekend. Typically, I'll hike alone, so I always keep a knife in my backpack for protection against wildlife. Should it ever come to that, though, in all my years of hiking, I've never once had to actually use it. In fact, I've never run into any dangerous situation while hiking. Well, at least up until a few days ago. I was driving to a heavily forested hiking trail I'd never been to before. Now, I hike in the afternoon, and this happened around the time of year where the days were starting to get shorter. In other words, the sun was setting earlier and earlier each day. This was a key detail that I had completely forgotten about prior to leaving. Only after I started driving to the place did I realize it would be completely dark outside before I would even be able to finish my hike. A decision I still regret making is deciding to do the hike anyway. I got a bad feeling about it right when I started. Fast forward a few hours, and I was now about 85% finished with the route I picked out. By this point, it was almost completely dark. I had a flashlight, but still, the whole scene was pretty eerie. This portion of the trail was deep in the forest. It was so dense with trees that the moonlight could barely even find its way through. Don't get me wrong, it was beautiful scenery in the day, but alone at night, it was nothing short of disturbing. It was then that I was really starting to regret my decision to carry out the hike. That's when I saw light up ahead on the trail. As soon as I shined my flashlight in its direction, it immediately got turned off. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't exactly turn back, so I was pretty much forced to go directly towards where it had been. In the back of my mind, I knew the chances of it being another hiker in the dark were slim to none. Eventually, I reached where the light came from. There was no one. Instead, there was a large duffel bag lying on the ground. I began scanning the trees with my flashlight. That's when a large, probably 6.5-foot man stepped out from behind one of the trees. My body completely froze up. There I stood, like a deer in headlights, shining my light on the guy. He then slowly revealed a machete from behind his back. Seeing this, I started running for my life down the trail and in the direction of my car. I looked behind me, and the guy was chasing me. I dropped my backpack so I could run faster. When I finally reached a clearing in the forest and could see my car, I was still sprinting. I grabbed my keys from my pocket and unlocked it. I got inside, locked the doors, and had the engine on in less than 5 seconds. However, the guy was still behind me and was able to completely slash one of my back tires before I could drive off. I drove on an almost completely flat tire for the next 5 miles back to my house. Right as I pulled into my driveway, I called the police and reported the man. Although I have no idea if he was found, quite frankly, I have no idea if the police even searched for him. A part of me wants to go back to retrieve my backpack, which contains hundreds of dollars in equipment, but there's no way I can bring myself to do it. Plus, there's no guarantee it's still even there. For all I know, the guy went back and took it. I still don't know what I stumbled upon that night. This was by far the scariest experience I've ever had and the closest I've ever felt to death. My friend Basil and I rent a house together. He's a pretty big partier, though, and often stays out really late or even sleeps over at others' places, so a lot of nights I have to myself. This was one of those nights where Basil was out at the club or something. So, having the night alone, I brought out a couple cans of beer to our front porch and sat on the swinging bench we had set up. It was nice weather out, and with it being nearly midnight, most people were sleeping, and the neighborhood was pretty quiet. After being out for a little less than an hour, a person came walking down the street in front of the houses. He looked like a large guy and had a sweatshirt on with a hood over his head, but something was off about the way he was walking. He was very stiff, like only his legs were moving, and his whole upper half wasn't. When he got up to the part of the road my house was in front of, he stopped and looked over at me. I waited a few seconds for him to say something, but he didn't say anything. He just stood there in the middle of the road, right in front of my house, and looked at me. "Hey buddy, you need something?" He stayed quiet for a moment, then started walking up my driveway. I stood up from the bench and yelled at him to leave, but once I realized he was getting pretty close, I hurried inside and locked the door behind me. I then watched out the peephole as the guy came right up to the door. He waited for another second before pulling out something from under his sweatshirt. It was hard to see from the small view I had, but it looked like maybe a hammer or crowbar or something. Once I saw that, I knew what was likely about to happen. I ran upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom, dialing 911 and trying to be quiet. I could hear the wood splintering off the door downstairs as I pleaded with the operator for help. Then there was a loud thud and silence. The broken door swaying on its hinges was the only sound. I waited anxiously, only assuming that I'd hear the guy's footsteps approaching the bedroom door at any second. But seconds turned to minutes until I heard a cop car pull into my driveway. I thought about running down to the officers, but the operator suddenly told me through the phone to stay where I was and wait for the cops to get to me. So, I sat back down. 30 seconds later, I heard one of the officers walking up the stairs, followed by them shouting and firing off a taser. The guy had been standing right outside the bedroom door, as if he was just waiting for me to open it. He was arrested and apparently was very drunk, but I have no clue who he was or why he did what he did. As far as the officers have told me, the guy wouldn't even say why he was walking down the road or what he was even doing there. All I know is if I had opened that door, it would have been the last thing I ever did. A few months ago, I was driving back to school from visiting my parents. It's about a 2-hour drive, so I usually keep myself entertained with music. I'm a 5 feet 3 inches, 21-year-old female driving my dad's little old pickup truck alone in the leftmost lane of a 3-lane highway, dorking around to the music on the radio. Suddenly, I noticed a semi-truck going the exact same speed as me in the rightmost lane. Embarrassed for getting caught in dork mode, I stopped singing and tried to speed up so he couldn't see me anymore. He matched my speed, which ticked me off a little bit, so I looked at the driver, expecting to see some angry jerk. To my surprise, he was smiling and waving. Thrown off, I kind of chuckled and waved back. Big mistake. He moved over to the middle lane to be closer to me and now wouldn't stop smiling and waving. At first, I played nice, waving back a little because a semi-truck beats a tiny pickup truck any day. But I was mostly focusing on getting out of this guy's field of vision safely. I tried speeding up as fast as my truck would allow and slowing down as suddenly as I could without endangering anyone behind me, but he would just match my speed. If there was someone coming up in his lane, he'd move to the right at the last possible second and pass them before I could slow down and get behind them. He has a lot more practice with reckless maneuvering than I do, so he has me trapped and is using other cars to help him. The whole time, he's smiling, waving, and holding up the number 1 sign for some reason I still don't know. His charm is rapidly fading as this continues for about 5 miles. I got worried and called 911. I gave them a description of the truck: white cargo truck, black cab with some Pennsylvania company logo on it, and the driver was a balding, middle-aged tan guy with a dirty blue t-shirt. They advised me to pull off to the emergency shoulder on the left, but I had never done that and it looked too narrow, so I didn't feel comfortable doing that. At this point, he was passing someone else in the middle lane, and I finally had a chance to slow down and merge 2 lanes over to the rightmost lane. I started speeding past him so he couldn't trap me again. The operator told me to take the closest service plaza about 5 miles away. She said he probably wouldn't follow me, so I could stop there for a few minutes before getting back on the highway. She told me to call if he did follow me, but she was confident he probably wouldn't, so she hung up. Now he's still holding up the sign and smiling this creepy, increasingly perverted grin at me while I avoid eye contact. The service plaza is in a quarter mile, and I'm not using any turn signals, but I guess he knew what I was doing because he braked hard and merged behind me right at the last second to join me in exiting to the service plaza. After I got my heart to start back up from the coronary area just experienced, I called 911 again. The way this service plaza was set up was that semi-trucks had to use a separate lane winding to the right of the plaza that led to a parking lot behind the plaza just for big trucks. The rest of us used a smaller lane to park immediately in front of the plaza. I parked, and as I'm explaining to the new operator what's going on, I watched the semi creep around its path while the driver stared me down, smiling. I freaked out. He knew where I had parked. He knew where to find me. If I just stayed there, I thought maybe I could have floored it to get back on the highway, but I was afraid he would see me and follow me again. So, I drove to a gas station to the left of the plaza, which had a view of the semi-truck parking lot, hoping he wouldn't find me until the police came. The operator transferred me to the woman who was helping me before. She informed me that they had dispatched a couple of police cars but couldn't tell me how long they would be. I saw the trucker had gotten out of his truck and was heading towards me. Even though my windows were closed and my doors were locked, I was panicking on the phone with the operator. She told me the police should be there soon and that I should be safe there, so I should sit tight while I kept her updated. I wanted to at least drive back to the parking lot I was in before, but it was a one-way entrance to the gas station, so I couldn't. I glared at the trucker and showed him my phone when he came close. He finally stopped smiling and made it look like he was going into the service plaza. I looked in my right side view mirror and found him hiding behind a big white pillar in front of the plaza, staring at me again. I freaked out and asked the operator where the cops were and if I could leave because he was being ultra creepy. She told me to sit tight again because they should be there any minute, so I did. Then he came out of hiding and started walking towards my truck. I put it in drive just in case and told the operator what he was doing. I refused to make eye contact with him but kept watching my mirrors to make sure I knew where he was. The smile was back, and he started walking in circles around my truck, looking at it as if looking for a way to get in. I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until he circled back behind me, floored it, and told the operator I wasn't waiting one more second for the police. She apologized and told me the police would look for the man and talk to him if they found him, and that I should focus on getting home safely while keeping an eye out for him. I don't know if they did that or not, but I know none of that would have happened if I had my boyfriend with me. So not only can't I walk alone, but I also can't drive alone as a female. Nice to know. The sound that woke me this time was clear, loud, and right outside the door. It was the sound of a man clearing his throat, the sound someone makes when they want your attention. My eyes shot up, and I moved to the glass, and there, just peeking over the lip of the door, I can see someone looking into my cab. I freeze, hoping they can't see me, but it doesn't matter. This guy's eyes are rolling back and forth, taking it all in, looking for whoever is inside. He looks crazy, like he'd given himself a haircut with a butter knife. Some of it was shaved, some of it was long, and I could see nicks along his scalp. I think his eyebrows were shaved off too, but it was hard to tell in the moonlight. I could literally feel this guy pulling on the door handle, making the entire truck move. I did the only thing that I could think of, shout as loud as I could. "What do you want?" I hollered at the glass, still motionless in the back of the cab. This is also a censored conversation as I remember swearing in literally every sentence that I spoke to this guy. He said, "It's me." "Who?" I asked. Okay, maybe this was a case of a mix-up. I sat up and reached for the club on the floor. "It's Henry, come on," he pleaded. "I don't know you. I'm not from here. Now please just get away from my truck," I explained to him. The conversation devolved from that point forward. Playing hard to get. "I like it. Let's do something different," he said. This guy went on at length about what he wanted to do to me. None of it involved violence at all. Everything this guy said was sexual from start to finish. I'm watching this guy lick the window of my semi as he tells me he wants to kiss my feet, worship me, pleasure every part of me. I'm not homophobic, but the whole thing was nauseating. As he's going on and on and on about his sexual fantasies, transitioning into what he wants me to do to him, I'm yelling for him to just please go away. Throughout the entire thing, his tone changes. He starts talking about his desires, which were much more violent. This guy wanted someone to hurt him during their sexual escapades, punched, choked, tied up, and abused, the whole shebang. I couldn't really believe what I was hearing. He switched from licking the window to tapping on it before finally smashing his fist into the glass. I had to do something. I remembered my portable DVD player and, for whatever reason, came up with this weird little plan. I opened it up and faced it away from the front of the cab so the light would illuminate my face, but he wouldn't be able to see what the light was coming from. "I'm calling the police," I said, hoping the light source would look like a car phone or a radio. "I've got your South Dakota plates too." "Nathan?" he asked. "I'm not who you're looking for." "Now get the hell out of here, man," was the last thing that I ever said to this person. I watched him leap down and start running all in one swift motion. The van fired up and, without even turning its headlights on, fled from the parking lot like a bat out of hell. Honestly, I ended up doing the same. After another inspection of the trailer and tires to make sure everything was secure, I rolled out and made for Livingston. That morning, I really played with the idea of calling the police and making some kind of report, but thought it would be more trouble than it was actually worth. I didn't have the actual plate number, just that it was a Dakota van, so I figured my report would go absolutely nowhere. It wasn't until I got out of trucking that I realized how common this type of encounter was, especially after the invention of Craigslist. Truck stops have always been known for midnight rendezvous, but became explicit for random hookups all over the country, particularly for traveling men who wanted to experiment. Whoever that Henry guy was, he thought I was Richard, who was probably another trucker rolling through Montana that night. Henry must have gotten the truck station mixed up, or Richard was late to the arrival, so he got us confused. Regardless and whatever the case, I'm very glad that I had my doors locked that night, as I could be telling a very different story right now. Have a plan when you hit the road and always stick to that plan. When things hit the fan with my parents, I had to move out. I was down on my luck living situation-wise and could only crash on the couches of my friends for so long. I was looking on all the roommate and apartment apps and websites, and I found something that caught my eye on this app. A man named Owen had listed a room for rent in his 3-bedroom, 1-story house. The rent price was $1,300 a month. He'd basically be my landlord and roommate, as he would also be living in the house. He made sure to note on the ad that he'd be out of the house most of the time and that the renter would have the place to themselves often. He did put in all capital letters a few ground rules though, including no parties, no large gatherings, no drinking in the living room, and no use of the basement. They seemed like pretty standard rules. I went to view the house in person and meet Owen. The second he opened the door, I got a bit of a read on him that he was a little reclusive. His demeanor was quiet and a little awkward. He showed me the house, and I could tell he was nervous because his voice would shake and he would stutter. The bedroom was a good size and the actual floor plan of the house was good. It was an open layout, meaning the kitchen, living room, and dining room were all one big open space. For $1,300 a month in my area, it was a steal. He laid out some more ground rules in person, and he emphasized again how I can't go in the attic or the basement as he used them for storage only. Sounded fair enough. On the spot, I told him I was interested. We shook hands, I left, and 2 days later I was moving in. We didn't draft any sort of lease or contract. I was just going to be paying him off the books month to month, the first day of every month. I had settled in pretty quickly. The bedroom I was renting was already furnished with a bed and basic furniture, so all I did really was hang some of my wall decor and fill the dresser and closet with clothes. The bedroom had a lock on it, thankfully, and he gave me the key to it so I could lock it when he wasn't home, which seemed like a nice gesture at first. Owen never told me what he did for work. He just told me he usually wouldn't be home, but I quickly learned that wasn't true. Anytime I'd come home from work, his car was always in the driveway. Quickly, I started to pick up on loud sounds outside of my bedroom at night, from footsteps to doors opening and closing constantly. One night, I went out in the middle of the night just to go to the bathroom and I noticed the basement door was opened. I walked over to the top of the stairs and looked down. There was a dim light from down there, seemingly from a far corner out of view. I heard banging sounds coming from down there. It was like 2 a.m. What could he be doing down there? Then the banging stopped and Owen appeared at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at me. It was so creepy that describing it in words doesn't do it justice. He looked visibly annoyed as he looked up at me. I apologized and said I was just going to the bathroom. He almost angrily responded, "Shut the basement door." I listened to him, insanely weirded out. I went to the bathroom and then back to bed. I laid awake for a while after that, now with my mind racing, wondering what he was doing. About a week later, I returned home and noticed my bedroom door was unlocked. I always locked it before leaving every day. I looked around my room to see if anything was missing, and while nothing seemed to be missing, I noticed some things had been moved. For starters, my clothes in the dressers were not neatly stacked anymore. They had been looked through, I could tell. The closet door was also cracked open. It was dawning on me that he had his own key and he likely came into my room and went through my stuff. This felt like a clear invasion of privacy and a violation of my tenant rights. I had to figure out how to confront him about it. I went to knock on his bedroom door, but he didn't answer. His car was in the driveway once again, so he had to be home. I was getting such weird vibes from all this. I gave up and went back to my room after microwaving my dinner. While I was in my room relaxing and watching TV, I heard the door to Owen's room open. I took this opportunity to get up and confront him, so I went out to the living room and caught him in a hurry about to leave the house. I stopped him and asked if he went into my room. He looked at me with a blank expression and straight up said no. I delicately responded without being hostile, saying that the door was unlocked and some of my stuff appeared to have been gone through. He then claimed that I had the only key to my bedroom, and then he said he's in a hurry, he has to go, and he left. I was flabbergasted by all of this. I wanted to ask my parents for advice, but at that time, I hated them and wanted nothing to do with them. I was already back on the apps and websites looking up other listings. I knew I didn't want to stay here. Then I realized this was the first apparent time that Owen wasn't home while I was. Curiosity got the better of me, and I had to check out the basement. I checked out the windows first to make sure his car was gone, and it was. I then went over to open the basement door. Oddly enough, I couldn't find any light switches, so I just used the flashlight on my phone to navigate around. The steps were so creaky I felt like I was in an abandoned house. I got to the bottom, and there was a tan carpet that was curling upwards at the walls as if it were poorly fitted to the floor. It was a very small basement, at least the main room there was. There was just this one ugly couch in the middle of the room. There was also a slightly funky smell down there, and the smell only got worse as I got closer to this door in the corner. I attempted to open the door, but unfortunately, it was locked, or maybe I should say fortunately, because I'm not sure I fully wanted to know what was in there admitting that smell. It almost smelled like raw sewage, but worse. I did one little quick sweep around the main room of the basement and found nothing, just some taped up cardboard boxes, which I was not going to open. I went back upstairs and shut the door. The rest of that night, I stayed in my room. I never heard Owen come back. He must have gotten back after I had fallen asleep. I woke up. The room was still dark. My alarm was not going off. Something else had woken me up. I heard the floor next to my bed creak, and I turned and saw Owen leaning over my bed, looking at me. I screamed, and he replied to me to shush and then asked me if I went into the basement. I screamed no. How did you get in here? I locked the door. He then asked me, are you sure? I flipped the cards on him and yelled, did you come into this room when I wasn't home? He replied no, then turned around and walked toward the door. I asked, how did you get in here then? I saw him hold up his hand in the dark. He wasn't holding anything at the time. I didn't know what it meant. He said to me before leaving the room, I think you should find other living arrangements, and then he closed the door. I started packing right then and there. I wasn't staying another minute in that house. I knocked on his door and yelled at him to give me half of the rent money back since I'd only been there like 2 weeks. Moments later, he opened the door, and just his arms stuck out from the door holding a small stack of $100 bills. He managed to make even handing me the money insanely creepy. I grabbed it. It was only $400. Whatever, it was close enough. I just wanted to get out of there. I was fully packed and out of there within an hour. I slept in my car that night. I ended up back at my parents' house the next day, and after explaining the ludicrous events I just went through, something changed where they were more welcoming to have me back. I still moved out a month later, but my parents and I are fine now. If you're choosing to have a random roommate from online, just be careful and use your best judgment after meeting them. It was my junior year of college. I had moved off campus into a student apartment building. My roommate was sort of assigned to me by the school in the sense that he was just someone else who needed someone to live with. His name was Arlo, and he seemed like a nice guy at first. He was friendly and polite, always smiling and making small talk. But as the days went by, I started to notice strange things about him, little quirks and odd behaviors that made me feel uneasy. It started with the way Arlo would always linger in my room, asking pushy questions about my personal life and poking around my belongings as if he were way too comfortable doing so. At first, I brushed it off as harmless curiosity, even if I found it kind of weird. But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. Then there were the sounds I would hear coming from Arlo's room late at night, talking and shuffling noises that were slightly concerning. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just Arlo watching TV or talking on the phone, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. One night, unable to sleep because of the strange noises coming from Arlo's room, I decided to investigate. I crept silently down the hallway and pressed my ear against Arlo's door, straining to hear what was going on inside. What I heard was just weird. It was the sound of Arlo whispering to himself, his voice low and muffled. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped, and there was nothing but silence. Then I heard, Kane. Arlo said my name. Did he somehow know I was outside his door? I quickly and quietly tiptoed away from his door and went back to my room. I silently crawled back into my bed. I didn't know what to make of this. Why was Arlo talking to himself? Was he hiding something from me, or was he sleepwalking? But then, how did he know I was outside of his room? I couldn't shake the feeling of uneasiness. The next day, I kept thinking about the night before. As the days went by and the sounds from Arlo's room persisted, my paranoia only grew worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that Arlo was hiding something from me. Arlo's behavior also became stranger. I started to notice little subtle changes in his behavior, like he would make strange glances at me, and his movements seemed a little furtive. One night, I woke up at some off hour in the night and heard Arlo's whispering voice from outside in the hallway, like right outside my door. It was genuinely freaking me out, and I was wondering if he was sleepwalking. I went to the door and put my ear up against it, and like last time, the whispering stopped. Then Arlo once again said, "Kane." This time I replied and said, "Yeah, you good?" He didn't respond. I just heard his footsteps walk away to his room. The following night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door closing. I heard Arlo's footsteps walking away in the hallway. This was getting out of hand. The next day, I decided to confront him about his potential sleepwalking. I told him I'd been hearing him walking around late at night and heard him close my door last night. I then asked him if he had ever been known to sleepwalk or have any kind of sleeping disorders. He seemed to not know how to answer at first, but then he said yes, he does tend to sleepwalk sometimes. I wasn't buying it, though. Something was up. I decided to search Arlo's room for answers. I knew it was risky, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. I waited until Arlo was out of the apartment, then I crept into his room. I knew that I might not have much time, so I searched quickly, tearing through drawers and closets in search of anything that might explain Arlo's strange nightly behavior. And then, just as I was about to give up, I found it, a small, nondescript drawer hidden at the back of Arlo's closet. I pulled it open, and my blood ran cold at what I found inside. It was a collection of photographs, dozens of them, mostly featuring me asleep and one other guy who looked to be our age. They were taken from different angles and distances, some of them so close up that I could see the pores on my skin and individual strands of hair on my head. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized what I was looking at. Arlo had been secretly taking pictures of me while I slept, without my knowledge or consent. I couldn't believe it. I had been living with some kind of sick voyeur. He had been violating my privacy and invading my personal space for who knows how long. I wanted to confront Arlo, to demand answers, but I was afraid of what he might do, afraid of what he might say, afraid of what might happen if I confronted him alone. So I took a picture of the contents of the drawer and then took a handful of the photos as evidence to use against Arlo. I packed my things, and the next day, I showed the photos to the department in charge of student housing accommodations, and they told me to let them take the appropriate action. I was lucky and got assigned to a different apartment with a normal person who needed a roommate. I never spoke to Arlo again. Even now, years later, I still can't shake the memory of those chilling photographs and Arlo's whispering and creeping around at night. I never found out who the other guy in the photos was. It was definitely his old roommate, but I was never able to find his name. But who knows, maybe he also found out. This happened when I was like 16 and in my heavy gaming phase, still living with my parents. I played a lot of League of Legends in my room on my computer in those days, especially in the summertime when it's so unbearably hot outside and I preferred to stay inside in the air conditioning. Anyway, way back when I lived at home, I'd have the place to myself a lot because my parents traveled a lot and I was the last one to move out. If I recall correctly, this was on a Friday night or a night that school was out the next day because I was staying up late. After I got home from school, I submitted a paper that was due that night to get it over with. Then, I had to do some shopping afterward on my mom's orders since they'd be gone for a while. It was how I earned my keep in the house, according to my dad. They left cash for me to use. I always had to show them the receipt though so that I wouldn't just pocket any of the money. My mom gave me a shopping list, so I went to Whole Foods in my old Camry, my first car. Shopping took about an hour. While in the grocery store, this guy in line behind me started talking to me, and I don't know why. He made a comment about one of the things I was buying and just wouldn't stop, even as I was bagging my groceries. He kept talking to me, which I found weird. He wasn't paying attention to anyone else. I was still nice though. When it was time to leave, I said, "Have a good one," and left. I went out to my car in the parking lot, packed the trunk, then headed home. It was a scorching hot day as we were in early June. I wasn't looking to go out and do anything outside. Once I was done with everything I needed to do, it was dark out by now, so I got right on League of Legends on my computer and texted my friend David to get on as well. He joined my party, and we played some dual rank as we always did. I was using my noise-canceling headset. We were committed already to playing League of Legends all night and ranking up, so of course, I needed to take a break to make dinner at some point. Probably 2 hours into playing, I told David I was going to eat dinner and I'd probably be back on in an hour. He said he'd be back on later too. So with that, I took a break and made some pasta for dinner. The kitchen is downstairs and my room is upstairs. While I was sitting in the kitchen eating, I knew for sure I heard a thump from upstairs. Did it sound like a footstep? I wasn't sure. It could have been any number of things, but the last thing I'd imagine it would be was a footstep. I did, however, go and lock the front door. Now, oftentimes for a while, I would leave the door unlocked just because my parents' house is in a good side of town, and I just never took the idea of a break-in seriously. It's something you hear about on the news, but don't think it'll ever happen to you. I went upstairs, and I don't know what I was expecting, but I said my brother Tristan's name into the hallway. I knew he wasn't supposed to be here, but I don't know. I heard a sound and I felt the urge to see if anyone was here. When no one answered back, I went back to my room and got back on League of Legends. I put my headset back on and texted David that I'm going back on. Shortly after, he came back on. We started playing again. A couple of games in, I looked to my left at the doorway of my room into the hallway. I don't know if something in my peripheral vision or some other sense felt something there, but I would leave the door open when I was home alone as my mom would tell me to. The hallway was dark except for the one little nightlight plugged into an outlet. My room shone blue from my wall lights. Some of the blue poured into the part of the hallway closest to my room. In between the crack of the door was total blackness. I couldn't see through it. I didn't think anything of it. After our next game, David said he was taking a leak and walked away. While we were in the lobby, I looked at my phone, then looked back out to the hallway, and I noticed something was different. Now I could see through the crack of the door into the hallway. My first thought was someone blocking it just minutes ago? By instinct, I spun my chair around to face the bed behind me, and there was a man sitting on my bed with his freakishly upright posture and his hands resting on his thighs. He almost looked to be smiling. I was so alarmed I jumped out of my seat onto the desk and crawled onto the desk, causing my monitor and basically everything else to fall off of it. I screamed, "What do you want?" and he started to actually smile now, showing his teeth like he was laughing. I ran out of the room into the hallway. I stopped halfway down the hallway and looked back at my bedroom door. I heard the springs of my bed lifting, and then the guy slowly walked into the doorway and stopped. He stood there. I once again yelled, "What do you want?" He then spoke in a stuttered, slow voice, asking if he could play too. I asked, "How did you get in here?" He stepped a few steps forward and pointed down the stairs. I assumed he was implying he entered through the front door. I was at a loss for what to do, so I ran down the stairs to the landline phone, as my cell phone was still in my room. I grabbed the phone and a kitchen knife and screamed, "You need to leave. I'm calling 911. I heard footsteps walking down the steps, and the last time I saw the guy was when he walked past the kitchen, looked at me, and then I heard him walking out the front door. I ran to slam it shut and lock it. For the first time ever, I was ashamed of myself for leaving the door completely unlocked. I held the phone for a few minutes, deciding whether to tell my parents. Ultimately, I did. My mom was concerned at first, then grew livid, so much so to the point that she put my dad on the phone. He told me to go through the house and make sure nothing was taken. I went through every room, and honestly, everything seemed in place. I said the man seemed like something was off about him. The man didn't seem overtly hostile, but something was wrong with him, and I don't know what his intention was. The image of him sitting on my bed and the realization that he was watching me through the crack in the door was haunting enough. When I was 18, I was very immature and naive. I was kind of a jerk when I was on the road, honking whenever I got impatient, borderline cutting people off. Looking back now, it was very stupid. If I ever have kids, I'll be that much more strict with them as far as their driving. That being said, I did drive a lot for someone my age. I went away to school 5 hours away from home. No matter what day of the week, traffic always gets atrocious the closer I get to home. So during breaks, I'll drive home at night to avoid this. What goes from a 4 to 5 hour drive down to a 3-hour drive? It was the beginning of winter break as the fall semester just ended. All my friends left for home on the same day. I just waited till later on in the night to head out because there's nothing I hate more than traffic. I used to drive a Mazda 3 that I would beat the ever-living crap out of, and admittedly, I used to be known for driving my car to a near-empty tank consistently. People would comment on it whenever they'd be in the car with me, and I'd always assure them that the car would still have at least 30 miles to go even after the needle would hit E. I found out the night I was driving home from school that I was wrong. I was only like an hour into my drive on the interstate. The needle was on E, and I was pushing my luck waiting for a gas station sign instead of looking up the nearest one on the map. The car started making these weird sounds suddenly and jolting, and that's when I realized I may have actually run the tank empty this time. I got off the first exit ramp and hoped it would lead right to a gas station. This exit was dark though, with no street lights, and there were just woods on either side. I was scared to slow down and lose my speed because I didn't know if I'd have enough gas to find a gas station. I blew through the stop sign at the end of the ramp and made a sharp left turn on the intersecting road, which was another dark road surrounded by woods. I was screwed. The car eventually came to a stop, and the engine died. Things only got worse when I took out my phone and saw I had no bars. I have T-Mobile, which is the worst possible reception anywhere far from a major city. I tried calling 911 because I was stupid and thought that 911 works even without reception. Of course, it didn't. I was terrified because I didn't know what to do. I turned on my hazard lights and just waited for someone to pass by. It was a long time before I saw headlights approaching. When I did, I flashed my headlights at them, and they passed me, made a U-turn, then pulled up on the grass behind me. I didn't know who was getting out of that car, though, and I was an 18-year-old defenseless girl. I just cracked the window down a little bit as this man approached my car. I told him I needed help. I ran out of gas. He offered to give me a ride to the nearest gas station. He was this bald guy with glasses on. He kind of looked trustworthy. I had no other apparent options but to accept his offer. I got out of the car and followed him to his car, making sure to lock my doors first. His car was a black Honda, year probably a 2010. It smelled funky in his car. I couldn't pin what the smell could be, though. He banged another U-turn and started driving in the direction he was driving before. He made conversation with me, asking where I was from and basic questions. I was honest with him that I was driving home from school. He said he lived in the area and that they don't get too many out-of-towners getting off the interstate for this quiet little town. The route we were taking lacked any buildings anywhere. It was just woods everywhere. I asked if he knew of any gas stations, and he said yeah, just a ways up the road. I started hearing bumping and thumping coming from the back of the vehicle. It sounded like the trunk. At first, I thought it was maybe just bumps in the road or a loose object in the trunk. He seemed to keep talking like he wouldn't stop. Finally, we got to a sort of town-looking area. There were some lights and buildings at last, a diner, and a few small houses. There was a red light at the first intersection since I got in his car. We came to a stop, and for the first time, there was silence. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of someone screaming in the trunk, followed by thumps and bangs. I looked at the man, who looked at me. In a split second, I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened the door, and ran while at the same time, he tried grabbing me and pulling me back into the car. I heard him get out as well, but instead of chasing me, he ran to close his passenger side door. Then I heard him floor it down the street. I ran into the diner and asked for help, making a scene. I used their phone to call 911. I waited there, and it became this whole huge thing with multiple police showing up to the diner to take a report. Given the gravity of the report that I was making, that I heard someone in the trunk of the car, they had to get every last detail from me about the man's car, his appearance, and where he picked me up. I was also given a ride back to my car so that they could also include the pickup location in the report. They also helped me get a hold of AAA, which eventually would come to my location to fill my car with gas. This was overall the scariest experience of my life. I was shaken to the core the whole rest of the ride home. I hope they found that man. I hope whoever was in that trunk is still alive today. For all I know, that man could have been bringing me to his house or somewhere else, and I was just lucky I had a chance to get out at that red light. This happened during the summer before my sophomore year in college. At that time, I was doing a lot of research for a place I could live during the coming school year that was close to campus. I found multiple good-looking apartments, but all of them were way out of my budget. I quickly figured out that if I wanted to live close to campus, I would need a roommate that could help pay each month's rent. I posted an ad on Craigslist explaining my situation, hoping someone would be interested. Not even an hour after I posted the ad, I got a response. Apparently, it was some older lady in her 70s. I was kind of expecting it to be another student from my university, but I figured it didn't really matter. As long as they were willing to pay half of the rent, I didn't really care. Plus, I didn't get any further responses in the next week, so I took the one opportunity one was given. Fast forward to the start of the school semester, and the two of us moved in. She introduced herself as Wilfred. She was short and had white hair. Although a little quiet, she seemed nice. I figured we'd get along fine, so I wasn't too worried about the coming months. A few weeks passed, and I never really saw her that much. We had the occasional small talk conversation when we were both in the kitchen, but that was about it. For the most part, she would spend all her time in her bedroom. Occasionally, while I was watching TV in the living room at night, I would hear this high-pitched giggling coming through the walls. The first few times it happened, I just assumed she was on her phone or something. But then I realized I never actually heard her talking. It was just her giggling. I couldn't imagine what she was doing. Over time, things just kept getting weirder. For example, she would start coming out of her room for no other purpose than to watch me. She would stand in the kitchen or hallway just looking at me while I watched TV or made myself dinner. Needless to say, I was getting more and more uncomfortable around her. One night, I woke up at around 2 a.m. to the sound of slight knocking on my bedroom door. Not knocking like trying to get my attention, but slow, soft, and barely audible knocking. I yelled out Wilfred's name, and right as I did, the knocking stopped. I knew it was her because shortly after, I heard her same giggling followed by footsteps walking back to her room. I'd be lying if I said this didn't freak me out. I didn't have a lock on my door, so nothing was stopping her from coming into my room while I was sleeping. I didn't sleep at all the rest of that night. I had planned on confronting her about this situation the next day, but she never left her room once. Come night again, I decided to move my desk in front of my door as a makeshift barricade because, again, I didn't have a lock on my door and I did not feel comfortable having nothing stopping her from entering my room. 3 hours later, I woke up to the sound of my desk being hit by my door from someone attempting to open it. It was Wilfred. I could see her eye peeking through the crack of the slightly open door. Before I could even say anything, she started screaming and banging on my door. My desk started to give way, so I got out of bed and held the door closed myself. The screaming and banging went on for 2 more minutes. Once it finally stopped, I got up and called the police. When they arrived, I opened the door to my bedroom and my heart dropped. Every single one of the knives from our kitchen had been stabbed into the door. I was absolutely horrified, but I tried to compose myself. I briefly explained the situation to the 2 officers that arrived. I also told them which room Wilfred was in. She would provide a struggle in being detained, but they would ultimately take her away. The next month, I moved to another apartment, this time with some actual students from my university. I still don't understand what made Wilfred do what she did. My best guess is she had some severe untreated condition she wasn't on medication for, but then again, maybe not. Maybe she seriously intended to use those knives on me in my sleep. But because I took the precaution of pushing my desk in front of my door, I luckily didn't have to find out. I live in a pretty basic suburban town on Long Island, New York. My girlfriend Valerie and I recently started renting a small house, perfect for 2 to 4 people. We have a decent-sized backyard, and our house is on a very quiet street. One side of our house has a water drainage basin, as the county calls it, which is just a bunch of trees surrounding a sump. On the other side is our neighbor Neil, who lives with his wife. They're a bit older, in their 60s, and quiet. Then directly across the street is a little patch of woods that's in front of another water drainage basin. So for people who like privacy out front, our house is perfect. But then there's the backyard. Neil's house is blocked off by some bushes that the landlord planted years ago, so besides the house directly behind us over the fence, there are no other houses that could see into the yard. However, That one house looking into our backyard was all it took to genuinely make Valerie and I uncomfortable. As I'm writing this, it's currently the fall, so we've been doing fall cleanup the past few weeks in the front and backyard. I started noticing that any time we were out there, there were these two people standing at the upstairs window of the house behind us. It was a middle-aged man and woman. When I'd look up to that window, they'd keep looking and watching me. It got really uncomfortable to the point we pretended not to notice it, but we could only stomach doing this for so long. The leaves kept falling day by day, and the fall cleaning would need to continue. Valerie wouldn't want to be in the yard anymore because she was getting so creeped out at those two people who would watch us out the window without fail. So one foggy day while raking, I looked up at the window and once again, the two were standing at the big rectangular window. I decided to wave at them to see if they'd wave back. After a few seconds of smiling and waving, they didn't move. No reaction, but I could feel their stares and I could see their eyeballs looking at me. I turned away from the window and tried to continue raking, but after sneaking a peek back at the window a couple of minutes later and seeing them still there, I felt too awkward and weird being out there. I went inside. Valerie said we should go over and introduce ourselves. At first, I was hesitant about that, but I was persuaded to walk around the block with her to that house and ring the bell. We expected one of those people at the window to answer the door, but instead, the door cracked open just enough to see half of a person's head. It didn't look like either of those people who were always at the window. It was also super dark in the house to the point that it looked incredibly ominous and uncanny staring at half of that person's face. This guy looked a lot younger, like in his 22-year-old. Valerie and I tried to be friendly and introduce ourselves. The guy seemed very closed off though and not interested in speaking. He had a very, "what do you need" type of attitude about him. When I asked if he lives with anyone else here, like his parents, he said no. I mentioned the man and woman who were always at the window upstairs, and the guy on the other side of the door said he doesn't know who I'm talking about. Valerie and I felt really unsettled, so we just left. But weirdly, as we walked down the walkway back to the sidewalk, I noticed the guy behind the door was still peering half of his face through the cracked open door. I'm sure he watched us walk away until we were out of sight. That interaction was weirder and creepier than we were expecting. When we got back home, I went upstairs to our room. The upstairs of our house is only our master bedroom and the bathroom. It has two windows. One of the windows looks over to that house over the fence. I looked out the window to see those two people looking out the window again, and even at this distance, I felt like they were staring right at me. I shut the blinds and went down to tell Valerie. We agreed it was time to plant some arborvitaes to block their window from view. The only problem is it's already the fall, and it's too late to plant any kind of trees. We have to make it through winter. After a few days of not looking outside the bedroom window or going into the backyard, one night we heard a strange knocking sound from downstairs. I told Valerie to wait in bed while I went downstairs. The knocking got louder, and I quickly discovered it wasn't the sound of knocking on one of the doors, but rather on the glass of one of the backyard windows. The blinds of it were, of course, shut because we didn't want those creepy people looking into our living room at night. I approached it, and yes, it was 100% a fist knocking on the glass. I considered saying, "Who's there?" but I froze, and I was too scared. Instead, I flicked on the backyard light, and then the knocking stopped. I didn't even want to look out the window or door. I kept the light on and then went back upstairs to my room where I told Valerie about the creepy knocking. But I claimed that I chased whoever it was away. I exaggerated in fear of sounding like a coward. I also didn't want her to worry. We both imagined it to have been something to do with that house though. Nothing has happened since, but I'll have to update throughout the winter. Update, it's been 2 weeks, and we haven't seen those people at the window ever since. But last night, we heard yelling and screaming from that house. I had to open our window, and it became clear there were muffled yells coming from that house. The fact that we heard it through 2 sets of closed windows just goes to show how loud the yelling was. Then, out of nowhere, it just stopped and went quiet. We almost called the police, but ultimately didn't. I'll update again if anything else happens, but we're really getting creeped out here now. One day when I was only 17 or so, my older sister and I were hanging outside together in the backyard. Our mom was probably upstairs reading or cleaning or something. My dad wasn't there, and I don't know where he was, probably work or something. I was on my phone, just scrolling through Instagram, lying down on the trampoline. My sister Ava was on the swing set, probably just doing the same thing I was doing. We would occasionally say something to each other about the videos we saw on our For You page, and we would send them to each other and laugh or whatever. Until we were interrupted by our neighbor Bella. We weren't super close with her, but my parents were, and my mother and she got along very well. "Hey guys, come here," she said, standing in her backyard where the fence met the middle of our property lines. We confusingly walked over to her as we had no idea what she wanted, but we knew to respect our elders, so we had to see what she was calling us for. She told us that we needed to go inside and get our mom and that she already called the police. What are you talking about?" my sister asked. "Just trust me. No time to explain right now. Please, just do as I say, guys," said Bella. "You guys are in danger. Run," she said. "Someone dangerous is lurking around your front yard." We reluctantly but also quickly scattered inside after that. We told our mom, and she looked outside, and there was a man on our front doorstep. I didn't recognize him at first as his head was shaved completely bald, but it was our old neighbor. Long story short, a few weeks before this, our neighbor was arrested for killing his wife and daughter, which I didn't know at this point, by the way. I'll get back to that later. My mom saw who it was and ordered us to run up to her room and to lock the door and to only open it if she asks, so we did. We were terrified, but we had to listen to our mom. We ran upstairs and we were waiting. My sister was crying, and I was trying to calm her down. Just by how freaked out Mom was, we both knew something was very wrong, and we were dying to know what was happening. After a few more minutes, our mom screamed and we heard glass shattering. Luckily, she was close to the stairs already and she was able to get to the room with us before the man grabbed her. We locked the door and put a dresser in front of it to buy us some time. This man was screaming like nobody's business that he was going to kill us and pounding on the door for over 5 minutes. Suddenly, it stopped. We heard police sirens in the distance and the man tried to run away. The cops almost had a shootout with him, but after some screaming and threatening, he finally subdued and was taken back to prison. So, this guy we're talking about is named Brian. He was charged with at least 2 counts of first-degree murder for killing his family. Like I said earlier, it was said that he escaped prison about 2 hours before this, and he wanted to come back to get revenge on my family. He was convinced that my father was the reason he got arrested. Brian thought he was going to walk away scot-free for killing his family, but he was under the impression that my dad snitched him out somehow. I'm not sure why he thinks that, as I don't know the whole story. My father won't talk to me about it, not that it matters anyway. I guess my mom and dad didn't tell me or my sister about what happened next door at first, but they said they were planning on it soon. They just didn't want us to freak out, supposedly. But that's about all I can get out of my dad about everything. Not even my mom knows the full story, unless she's lying to us. My parents probably thought there was no urgency to tell us what happened next door since he was locked away in prison at the time. But somehow, he escaped and was looking for revenge. Hopefully, they have him under control in there this time. It was personal, and he escaped just to try and murder us. I went to summer camp a few times when I was a Boy Scout. It was usually pretty fun, especially the parts of the day we got to spend doing whatever we wanted. Nobody was actually invested in earning numeric badges unless it was for something cool, like wakeboarding. All we really cared about was messing around in the woods and swimming in the springs to beat the heat. It was a nice time just to be away from home and our parents for a week. The only thing a Boy Scout was missing was a girl to gallivant with. In the beginning, I thought I would go to summer camp every year if I could. However, things took a turn when I was 13 years old. After this trip, I left my troop and never went camping again. It was on the 4th day of summer camp, right in the middle of everything as far as responsibilities were concerned. It was a light day for me and my friends, 4 of us in all. We ran around the main common area of the campgrounds, used our allowances to buy ourselves each a souvenir knife at the general store, drank some yoo-hoos, and threw some tomahawks with the weapons guy between his classes. Eventually, 2 of us decided that we were getting tired and sweaty and just wanted to sit around in our tents until dinner time. But my closer friend Enoch and I wanted to keep it going. There was a network of trails that snaked all around the various campsites. We'd already taken the trail to the springs, so Enoch and I wanted to do a little more exploration. There were just the 2 of us, so we both had canteens full of water and snacks in our pockets, along with knives and cordage, a map, a compass, and I had a small first aid kit. We thought we were prepared for whatever we would run into out there. We didn't plan on going far either since we had to be back in a little under 3 hours for dinner. We set out from our troop's campsite with plenty of daylight left and made our way into a mosquito-infested area of woods. The canopy shaded us pretty well, and the air was humid and stifling. We wanted to see what it was like out there, but all we discovered was that the trees were a bit taller. It wasn't long before we started to make conversation over the sound of afternoon bugs, the sort of bonding you would expect to occur between 2 13-year-olds in the woods. We talked about girls mostly and the ones that we thought were ugly, so on and so forth. None of it was very tasteful, admittedly. We jokingly proposed that it was possible for us to go far enough that we would find our way into the Girl Scout section of the campgrounds, which did exist but was well separated from the Boy Scouts. Then, our surroundings started to change inexplicably. Suddenly, there was a breeze washing away the warm blanket of moist, motionless air and replacing it with cool, dry wind. Initially, this was a great relief to me and Enoch, who had been sweating profusely for hours, even in the shade. It also seemed to drive away all the mosquitoes and gnats, which was a welcome bonus. But just a few moments later, the woods quickly darkened, and the sky above us, between the branches of the canopy, went from vibrant blue to a pale gray. "Hey Enoch," I said, concerned, "I think it's about to rain." "No kidding," he agreed. "More like we're about to get caught up in a thunderstorm. Should we turn back?" I suggested. "No," Enoch replied with confidence, looking down at his compass. "The trail that we're on loops back to camp. Right now we're heading due north, which means we're right in the middle. We might as well just keep going." "Well, sure," I said. Enoch seemed to be pretty confident about his navigation skills, so I let him make the decision to press on. However, the threat of being soaked to the bone put a damper on the mood, and as such, there was a lull in the conversation. We hiked on, listening for oncoming thunder and waiting to feel the first raindrop land on our heads, except it never came. The darkness that descended on us only increased, but rain never fell. "Hey Enoch," I said again, even more concerned this time. "Will you check the time, man? I think we might have missed dinner." Enoch looked down at his watch. "No way, man. We've only been hiking 4, and then, suddenly, Enoch went silent and stopped in his tracks. "What is it, man?" I asked. "My watch is dead," he said gravely. "How is that possible? I thought you replaced the battery before going to camp." Enoch silenced me and started looking all around. "You hear that?" he whispered. I listened but didn't hear anything. Actually, I heard so much of nothing that it struck fear into my heart. It was totally silent, not a sound in the woods all around us. It was an unnatural quiet, devoid of any cicadas or even flies. For a minute, I peered deeper and deeper into the woods with my ears and heard only silence. Until finally, I heard singing, angelic singing, but it was so soft and quiet that it was almost inaudible but unmistakably the voice of a beautiful woman. Just by the way Enoch looked at me in that moment, wide-eyed and grinning, I knew he heard it too. "Oh, it's the Girl Scouts," he exclaimed. Before I could even respond, he bolted into the woods to go after the sounds. "Wait, Enoch, stop," I started to go with him. But by the time I had taken 10 steps off the trail, I realized I couldn't see well enough to go any farther. It was like the sky had fallen, darkness, like the dead of midnight, had snuffed out the light of day in merely a moment. A deep sense of dread filled my body, telling me to turn back. I backtracked the 10 steps I had taken without even turning around until I felt the flatness of the trail beneath my shoe again. At this point, all I could hear was my own breathing and heartbeat, and the singing, whoever was in the woods, growing louder and drawing near. But something was wrong. The sound no longer came from a single direction. Somehow, it was circling all around me, closing in on me. It was too loud to bear, and I felt like it was putting physical pressure on my body. I tried to cover my ears, but it was just useless. It all became a single, piercing cry. Finally, I heard a scream, a boy's scream. It cut through the cacophony and returned my surroundings to total silence, except for the echo of someone's cry for help. "Enoch," I called into the woods. "Come back," there was no reply. A moment later, I heard a twig snap on the trail from the direction we'd just come from. I hoped to see Enoch, but I didn't. Instead, there was an inhumane figure at the nearest bend in the trail, the shape of a tall woman, but composed of no flesh or bone whatsoever, only ominous light. As I gazed upon whatever spirit this was, it suddenly raced toward me. What I did next was pure instinct. I abandoned Enoch and ran blindly down the trail as quickly as my body could take me. I didn't stop until I spilled out into the campsite again, collapsing to the ground. When I looked up, I saw that everything was different. The sun was shining, the woods were alive with birds and bugs, and all of my friends were coming to see what was wrong with me, why I was so upset and panicky. I couldn't speak a word for hours. When I could finally tell the scout masters what happened, they didn't believe me. They sent a search party for Enoch, but they couldn't find a single trace of him. Even the police were never able to locate him, he simply vanished. Suspicion eventually turned to me because the story I told was so unbelievable. So, to avoid being put in an asylum, I ended up changing my official statement to losing track of him when we both went to take a piss at separate trees. I turned my back for just a minute, and then he was gone. In my worry and panic, I thought I saw something that wasn't there. But it's all lies because I know what happened. I'm 18 years old and going to be a freshman in college this September. This past July, my friend Zelda held a pool party in her backyard as a sort of graduation party, minus any of her family being around because her parents were away. She often has the house to herself, so her parents' house is the go-to spot for a lot of hangouts. She invited like 100 people from our grade. There had to be upwards of 150 people there at the night's peak. I was one of the first to show up with my friend Jonah because we're close with Zelda, so we wanted to help out a little bit. By the time people started showing up, everyone congregated slowly from the kitchen and living room to outside in the backyard by the pool. Some people brought their bathing suits and jumped into the pool, others just jumped in their underwear, and then, of course, most others just stood around the pool. She has a huge backyard. At a certain point, so many people were at the party that it was clear as day people were bringing friends from other schools because we didn't know everyone there. Zelda was getting mad because she made it clear she didn't want randoms. In fact, unfamiliar people seemed to be just barging through the gate, not even accompanied by people from our school or grade. There wasn't much we could do, though. The party was already too crazy to easily control. Zelda did throw in our class group chat not to bring any more randoms or they'd be asked to leave. The problems seemed to slow down after that. At around 1 a.m., the police came to the house and had to shut down the party due to multiple complaints from neighbors, so the music was turned off, and 99% of the guests were asked to leave. Mostly everyone cleared out except a few close friends, including some of Zelda's girlfriends, Letitia and I, and a few other guy friends. We helped do some cleaning, like picking up all the empty cans and bottles. Eventually, it was just 4 of us left there. I'm talking at like 3 a.m., if not later. Since it was hot outside, we migrated to the inside of the house in the air conditioning, where we were just chilling in the living room, continuing to drink. Then we all heard a distinct crack from upstairs, and we went silent. Zelda was the first to ask what was that as we all looked at each other with these wide-eyed, half-laughing, half-freaked-out faces. Letitia and I left, teasing Zelda that someone was upstairs in her room, and she begged us to stop and check it out, so we did. We went upstairs to Zelda's room. It was clear. We then went to the guest room that used to be her older brother's room, and we found one of our friends, Eudora, passed out in the bed. We went downstairs to tell her that Eudora was upstairs and knocked out. I guess that gave her a sigh of relief. Looking back, that didn't much explain a sound coming from upstairs if he was knocked out in bed, though, but we weren't exactly the most coherent at that moment. Eventually, Zelda and her friend Mia went to sleep in her room, Letitia fell asleep on the couch, and I went to her parents' bed. None of us were okay to drive anywhere. I can't remember how much time passed before I remember one of the girls screaming in the next room over, and then both of them. It was a heart-dropping kind of moment, but I didn't know if they were messing around with each other at first or not, but I realized pretty quickly the screams were way too real. I burst out of the bed and went to Zelda's room and opened the door. The lights were out. I could barely see anything except for the 2 girls huddled up, hugging each other in the corner of the room, basically curled up on the floor. I saw what they were screaming at. There was a tall person in the opposite corner of the room, on the other side of the bed from them. I saw him looking at me in the doorway. I yelled at the girls to run, and they did. There was so much yelling that even Eudora woke up and came out as the girls ran downstairs, screaming that the man was touching their feet. We followed, but looking back with 3 guys there, we regrettably didn't try to overpower that one man. We all left the house, and one of us called the police, waiting by the neighbor's house with the neighbors, possibly the same ones who called the cops on the party. We didn't see the man leave the front door ever, and after police searched the house and couldn't find him, that meant he left through the back door. None of us recognized who that man was. It was probably an older man who knew Zelda somehow that snuck into the house during the commotion of the party and thought Zelda would be alone after the party. It's some sick, scary stuff. Whether we could have overpowered him or not, we'll never know because we don't know if he was armed. Summer is the greatest season by a long shot. That's a hill I'll die on any day. My love for the summer doesn't revolve around partying or drinking, as you may expect, but nature, warmer weather, and the outdoors are inseparable in my opinion. And I guarantee you that when the heat rolls through, I spend more hours outside than inside. It was a warm night in mid-June a few summers ago when this happened. I was 16 or 17 at the time. For context, there's a massive nature preserve near my house. When I say massive, I mean it. It's close to 1,000 acres in size. To this day, there are still parts of it that I'm positive I haven't explored. 2 of my friends and I agreed to spend a night camping in those woods. Technically, camping there was strictly forbidden and borderline illegal, but we figured that there was no chance someone would catch us in this dense forest. We just had to trek as deeply as possible. Zane was the camping fanatic of the group. I'm telling you, this kid loved cosplaying as a Boy Scout and probably knew close to 100 different knots. Our other friend Clement always supplied the drinks. If we were sober, he was unhappy. That's just how things went when Clement was involved. I remember the feeling of the gentle summer breeze blowing through my hair as the 3 of us packed up Clement's car. The weather was ideal, not too cold, not too hot. A few beers later, the 3 of us found ourselves lugging camping equipment through the woods at like 11:40. I can't lie, I was feeling the alcohol start to hit me as we marched along. Zane always carried this industrial-grade flashlight with him, so the darkness of the forest wasn't much of an issue. As much as I enjoyed the outdoors, though, traversing through thick woods at this hour was a bit creepy, even with Zane's flashlight on hand. After close to half an hour of straight walking, the 3 of us found ourselves in a small flat clearing that was an ideal spot to set up camp. We pitched our tent as per Zane's instruction and set our chairs up. The fire was the next step. Zane once again took the lead on this, and after a few more minutes, we had a pretty decent fire going. Clement reached into his bag and tossed me another drink. He then grabbed his JBL speaker and started playing some music. The vibe was perfect, and we must have been talking and drinking for a good 2 hours. We were all pretty drunk at that point, and I could tell the other guys were just about ready to pack it up for the night. Clement turned the music down and started collecting discarded beer cans. Just then, a deafening whistle pierced the silence. I nearly jumped out of my seat, going from drunken haze to high alert in a matter of seconds. I don't know how to describe it. The whistle was abnormally loud but still sounded distant. Clement quickly shut the speaker off, and the 3 of us sat in silence as we exchanged concerned looks. I could feel my heartbeat pounding through my chest. We sat there frozen in place for what seemed like forever, listening intently to our surroundings, but there was nothing. It almost seemed quieter now than it had when we first got there, like eerily quiet. Not even the normal wood sounds you come to anticipate. I used that time to replay my memory of the whistle back in my head. It definitely wasn't an animal's noise. The best way I can describe it is a standard whistle you would hear at a ballpark. Zane finally broke the silence, quietly urging us to pack up and leave. Clement and I disagreed with that plan, though. We might risk encountering whoever made the noise, which I was beyond terrified of. It was past 3 a.m. at this point, and an encounter this late would only mean trouble. Zane hypothesized that whoever made that noise was probably aware of our presence, which was a chilling thought. I didn't know what to do. On one hand, staying put violated every survival instinct I had. Packing up and leaving at this hour didn't seem like a much better option either, though. We finally agreed to wait it out. I went to put the fire out, but Zane cautioned me against it, saying that a fire would repel any dangerous animals. Only then did the true gravity of the situation smack me in the face. We were literally miles away from any civilization. It was 3 a.m., and there was an unknown entity somewhere in the darkness. Another 10 minutes or so passed, and we had resumed talking, but at a much lower volume and with no music. I don't think any of us felt safe going to sleep just yet. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Something small flew over the darkness of Clement's shoulder and landed directly in the fire. It was a firecracker. I screamed bloody murder as it started sparkling in the fire, and Zane cursed as he sprung up out of his chair and bolted into the darkness. Clement and I scrambled to follow, leaving all of our stuff behind. We caught up with Zane, whose flashlight was beaming wildly through the woods as he frantically sprinted. We ran until we couldn't anymore, and Clement keeled over and threw up. Zane shut the light off, and the three of us stood there panting, trying to figure out if we were being followed. To my surprise, it didn't seem like anyone followed us. I don't think I've ever been so afraid. Why in the world would someone have done that? We needed to figure out what to do. Clement wanted to just find our way out of the woods and never come back, but Zane was reluctant to leave all of his camping gear behind. Plus, he reminded us the fire was still active. I was dumbfounded. How could he be concerned with forest fires after what had just happened? Eventually, I agreed with Zane that we should at least check on the site. After all, no one had actually chased us, so there was a slight possibility that whoever threw that firecracker was just playing a cruel prank. Zane was a navigational expert and was actually able to retrace our footsteps. I could make out the glow of the fire as we quietly approached. Before I could get any closer, though, Clement put a hand in front of me and pointed with a horrified look on his face. I strained my eyes to make out the sight in the distance. What I saw is probably the most terrifying thing I'd ever laid eyes on. There were 3 people sitting motionlessly in our chairs like statues. The one whose face I could see looked lifeless, and his mouth was open. I was afraid to move. What were they even doing? I thought, realizing that they weren't even talking. This was not normal. The 3 of us watched for a little while longer before deciding to back off. We turned to leave, but Clement's foot clipped a rock, causing him to curse in frustration. Within seconds, the glow from the fire abruptly went dark, as if it had been covered with a cloak. It was freakishly fast. We didn't stick around another second. We again sprinted away from the site, but this time we could hear footsteps crashing behind us. We didn't stop this time. We bolted out of the woods and ran all the way to Clement's car. By some miracle, we weren't followed out of the woods. None of us spoke on the drive back, each of us lost in our thoughts. The next day, Zane insisted we return to the site in the daylight to collect his belongings. Clement wanted nothing to do with that, but I agreed to accompany Zane. After some searching, we eventually found the site, which looked mostly untouched. That is, until we got a little closer and noticed the putrid smell coming from Zane's tent. He unzipped it, and we found a dead, rotting rat. It was sickening. I took the hint and haven't been back to that preserve since. Foreign off this chick that was a little unstable to say the least. She'd probably kill me if she heard what I was about to say using her real name, so for my own sake, I'm going to refer to her as Jane. To make a long backstory short, she came from a messed up family, and her dad was sort of at the center of a lot of her problems. When he finally died, she told me she went to the funeral just so she could find out where he was buried. A few days later, in the middle of the night, Jane called to ask me to take her to the cemetery to smash his gravestone. Although that was something I would never do to anyone, no matter how much I hated them, I could understand why Jane would want to do something like that against her father's memory. She didn't have a license, so I picked her up and we drove to the cemetery. When I parked the car in the visitor lot outside, she pulled a hammer and a handful of grocery bags out of her purse. She said she just wanted to go in, smash it up into a bunch of small pieces, bag it up, and leave. Obviously, I knew that we were breaking at least one law by trespassing into the cemetery after dark, but this was all right with me. I just told her I would keep an eye out for anyone in the area while she did what she needed to do. On that note, we got out and hurried over to the grave. Jane knew exactly where it was, so it took us no time at all, but I was still extremely nervous about the whole thing. It wasn't just the threat of being arrested, but the vibe of the cemetery itself. I really felt like I wasn't supposed to be there, like we were disturbing all those dead people by marching through in the middle of the night. I kept my hat on straight and tried to give Jane space. At first, she spent a minute kneeling on top of the relatively fresh grave, whispering a bunch of curses and crying just from the sheer intensity of whatever emotion she was feeling. But then, without warning, she started screaming and striking the headstone. The first time caught me so off guard that it sent chills through my whole body. I spun around and was about to tell her to quiet down, but at first glance, I knew she wasn't going to hear me. She was going absolutely berserk on this stone, screaming and wailing at the top of her lungs. Each time she hit it with the hammer, only a small piece would break off. I realized we were going to be there for a while if it went on at this pace, and she was making so much god-awful noise I was terrified that somebody in the nearby neighborhood would hear us. I also thought about how blood-curdling it would feel to be walking by the graveyard and hear Jane's banshee-like shrieking in the distance, and to be unsure if she was like a ghost or a serial killer or something. My instinct set in and I became more concerned about my own safety than anything else. Here was this completely unhinged, crazy person violently thrashing her way through a mixture of grief and unhealed trauma, seeing red with total tunnel vision, and I was alone with her, surrounded by darkness and dead people. I was worried that if I got near her, she would forget it was me and think I was the ghost of her father and start trying to kill me or something, so I backed away. However, it wasn't long before the deep-seated rage within Jane started to wear off a bit and she became tired. She then stopped and looked at the progress she had made. 2/3 of the headstone was still intact, but she was already exhausted. That's when she looked back at me, and for the first time, I saw the look of unveiled insanity in Jane's eyes. I'd always known Jane had a few screws loose, but this was next-level crazy. All her movements were sudden and jarring. She stood and shoved the hammer into my chest, telling me to take it and finish the job. I protested at first, not wanting to get roped further into what I thought was Jane's thing she needed to do, but as soon as I did, she grabbed me by the ears and yanked my head down so that my face was less than an inch away from hers. She then screamed so loud that it practically ruptured my eardrums. She demanded that I break the gravestone for her, or she'd use the hammer on me and bury my body next to her father's. Seeing that I was in too deep to back out, I reluctantly accepted the task and committed myself to making short work of it. Of course, I was stronger than Jane, but I wasn't nearly as uninhibited. What happened next, though, made me all the more sure that I shouldn't have tried to fight her or anything. As I was hacking away at the stone, managing to break off bigger pieces, she was standing behind me laughing like an absolute maniac. She was cheering me on the way I imagine a witch would encourage another witch to their first human sacrifice. I tried my best to ignore her, but it was impossible. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that she had pulled out a knife, which sent another chill down my spine. Before I knew it, she knelt behind me and straddled my back, throwing her arms over my shoulders, whispering little pure evil into my ears. I froze up and stopped swinging the hammer because I didn't want to hit her. She told me I was almost done. Then she did something I'll never forget. Both of her hands were out in front of me, one of which held the knife right before my eyes. She put the blade to her palm and sliced it open, creating a fountain of blood which quickly spilled down her wrist. Then she whispered some kind of satanic blessing in tongues and smeared her bloody hand over my face, from my forehead down to my chin, then across my throat until she finally rested her hand with a vice grip at the base of my neck. She asked me if I could taste the blood, and I said I could. She took pleasure in this, and then she finally let go of me to stand on the grave again. Then she screamed out at the top of her lungs that these would be the final tears she would ever cry over her father. As she looked up into the night sky with her eyes open, she put her hand up to the moon and clenched her fist, squeezing the wound to form drops of blood which fell down upon her eyes and face. I watched this whole thing, stunned out of my mind, until she looked back at me with her face full of bloody tears and growled at me to finish the job. Of course, I was thoroughly terrified of Jane by this point and I was ready to leave. I just did as she said. At last, when the whole thing was smashed to bits, I convinced Jane that we needed to go. Thankfully, she seemed ready, but the entire time we were picking up the pieces and bagging them, she was giggling. When it was all cleaned up, we ran back to my car, somehow going through this whole entire ordeal without anyone seeing us or calling the cops on us. I drove Jane back home and I dropped her off. As she got out of my car, she tried to drag me out to spend the night with her. I'd been waiting for that night for months, but by then I knew where that would go. I knew it would be no good for me, so I made up some excuse about having to work the next day in the morning. I cut off all contact and I've been avoiding her out of fear ever since. In my mid-30s, about 10 years ago, I worked as security personnel at a cemetery. It was located in a not-so-great part of the city, so having someone on site 24/7 was necessary. Even then, we'd still get people sneaking in and spraying graffiti on the stones or even trying to dig up graves. Most of these stunts happened at night, which was good for me because I always worked the evening shift, usually from 2 to 10. Granted, I'd still have to be there alone for a couple of hours into the night, between 8 and 10, but it was still much better than the alternative graveyard shift. On this day, I was warned about some people coming by the cemetery at random hours and just sort of stalking the place. It had been going on for a few days, and the other workers weren't sure who they were or what they were doing. I said I'd keep an eye out. By 6 o'clock, the other workers had left, and it was just me. This was always my favorite half of my shift because I wouldn't have to worry about looking like I was busy the whole time. If we're being real, there wasn't ever much point to me being there when the other workers were around too anyway. If you don't already know, The job is made up mostly of riding around in a golf cart and making sure nothing is going on. From 6 to 8, I drove around and picked up a few pieces of trash left in the yard. There were a few more visitors that came, and at 8:30, I waited for the last people to leave. Then I went to lock up the front gate. While wrapping the chain around the bars and putting the lock on, I noticed a group of people on the other side of the road. They were facing my direction like they were watching me. I finished securing the gate, then got back in my cart and drove off. I knew that it was likely the group I was told to keep an eye out for, so I parked the cart in a spot where I could still see them. There were 3 people from what I could see. They stayed in the same spot for a couple of minutes before walking away. I drove around, making sure they weren't trying to find a way in on the sides, but I didn't see them. Around 9 o'clock, I parked by the front gate again for a few minutes when I heard a sharp sound echo through the field. I whipped my head around in the direction it came from, but it was too dark to see. I started the cart back up and made my way through the field. The sound was so echoey and loud that I couldn't tell if it was from inside the cemetery or from just outside of it. As I drove through, I started to see some figures in the distance. Only 2 figures though, not the 3 I'd seen earlier. As I pulled closer, they noticed me, turning their bodies to face me but not running. I stopped the cart maybe 15 feet away and got out. The place closes at 8:30. "You gotta go," I called out. I took a few steps forward. "Do I really have to call the cops?" I said, getting more irritated and slightly more nervous. That's when I noticed one of them was holding something. It was a shovel, but they weren't really standing close to any gravestones. I looked down at the ground next to them, and there was a clear spot they'd been digging in. Then out of nowhere, I heard a guy behind me yell. The 2 started running, and the one behind me ran in a different direction. I got in the cart and turned it on to try and chase the one guy, but right away, I could feel that something was wrong with the cart. It was shaking and wobbling when I tried to drive it. I got out, and it was clear that the 2 left tires had been slashed. I frantically called the police and ran to the main building. Thankfully, the group didn't seem interested in chasing me, but seeing as they had likely slashed the tires with a knife and that there were 3 of them, I was terrified. When the police arrived, the group was long gone, but we did find the half-dugout hole they made. We were really confused by it until we found something else along the fence not far from the hole they were digging. We found a body bag. Yes, unfortunately, there was a body in it. After some days went by, it came out that the man in the bag was part of some gang and must have been killed in a shooting. What we think is that the group was trying to dispose of the body discreetly and thought that if they dug a grave and buried him in a cemetery, then it would blend in and nobody would find it. I can't say it was a terrible plan, but the execution of it wasn't the best. Although none of the men in the group were ever found or identified. I work at a cemetery on the edge of my town. It's a small one, being only a few acres of land. I've been working there for a year at the time, and I hated every minute of it. Not really because it was a cemetery, but just because it was boring. I was alone all night and sat in a small room for most of the time. There were 2 cameras set up on either side of the yard and one on the entrance of the tiny building I was in. My boss always told me that my job was to just be there, and if anything actually happens, then to call the police and let them take care of it. In the whole year before this, not a single thing happened. Again, it was a small cemetery in a small town, so not a lot of action was expected. On a Monday evening, I pulled into the parking lot and relieved my coworker from his day shift. I hadn't slept the best that day, so I brought a cup of coffee to help keep me up. For the first hour, I was sipping on my coffee and watching the cameras while also scrolling through my phone a bit. Come 1 a.m., I started to get really drowsy. I was nodding off in my chair, and the coffee wasn't really helping either. In the middle of the hour, I guess I fully fell asleep. What I think was 20 or so minutes later, I woke up to an odd sound, metal creaking behind me. I swiveled around in my chair. The door to my building was cracked open, swaying slightly from the wind outside. My heart hurt from the strike of fear it gave me. I got up and pulled the door further open, peeking my head outside and looking around. Nobody was in sight. I slammed the door firmly shut and made sure it was fully locked. It could have been a simple mistake, not fully closing the door, but it got my hair standing up. I rolled back the footage outside the building and didn't see anyone coming up to the building. At least after this, I was wide awake. I was constantly checking each camera. About 10 minutes later, I saw something move on the screen. It was the camera on the far end of the yard. Someone was walking through the cemetery. I watched as they slowly made their way past several gravestones, then stopped. I waited a few seconds before picking up the phone and dialing 911, still keeping my eyes on the screen. I spoke softly into the phone, telling the operator that I worked at the cemetery and there was a man trespassing. The woman on the phone started responding when suddenly the man sprinted through the yard and off of the screen. I let out an uncontrollable gasp, moving my eyes all around the other cameras looking for him. A second later, he appeared on the other screen, sprinting past it again, and not long after, he appeared on the screen showing the outside of the building I was in. I told the woman what was going on, that I needed to be quiet. I put the phone down and stared at the camera. It was a man who was now standing right outside the door. Then he looked around at the face of the building before locking his eyes on the camera. It made me shiver, seeing him stare at the camera as if he could see me through the screen. "Hello. Can you help me?" I heard his muffled voice from the other side of the door. Then, without even waiting for an answer, he walked around to the back of the building. There were no cameras on that side, but I could hear his footsteps in the grass. He sounded like he was walking right up against the wall. Then out of nowhere, I heard his footsteps departing quickly. My heart was racing all the way up until the police came. I thought I'd sound crazy, but they found very defined shoe prints in the grass. They followed them far off, way past the cemetery border, but lost the trail before it led anywhere else. The man's behavior was very odd, and the way he asked for help was even odder. I don't know if the door being opened earlier was somehow him, but I don't know what to believe anymore. Despite being scared shitless, I continued working and still worked there. Nothing else has happened, and the man never returned, but I don't think I'll ever fall asleep at the cemetery again. I work in the pro department of a home improvement company. I work the closing shift with another cashier, who I'll call Aria. Aria's a really kind but quite timid cashier. She's also very pretty, so she has a lot of contractors hit on her. It's usually not that worrisome, though a few compliments, maybe a dinner invite, which she politely declined. I would probably ask her out as well if it wasn't for one detail: Aria does have a girlfriend. So being hit on by guys on a daily basis makes her rather uncomfortable. When we first met, I told her she ought to tell those guys about being gay, but she kept saying it wasn't any of their business, so she kept that part to herself. Aria has become my best friend, and having another cashier there with you keeps things from getting lonely. We even cover for each other's lunch breaks. One day, when I came back from lunch, Arya started telling me about this rather creepy guy who was flirting with her. She said she politely turned him down, saying she was with someone already, and while he didn't seem happy, he did leave. I shrugged it off as nothing more than the usual horny guy and laughed it off. But later that day, the man came back. Arya wasn't there, as she had left to help a customer find some lumber, so it was just me. He looked rather normal, probably handsome to most women, but he acted off. After looking around the area, I asked him if I could help him with anything. "I'm here to see Arya," he told me. I asked him how he knew her, and he said he had come in earlier and asked her out, to which she said yes, so he had come back in to pick her up. I told him she had left for the day, a usual lie everyone tells to cover for their friends. His smile went away as he started looking annoyed. He said he wanted to speak to Arya and ask her out again, which contradicted what he had just told me about accepting his previous invite. I told him he could not do that, which caused him to cross his arms and asked me why not. I'm not the best liar when it comes to making up excuses on the spot, however. I didn't want to tell him Arya was gay if she didn't want him to know it. So I just blurted out that Arya was my fiancée. His annoyed look went to confusion as he asked me how someone as pretty as she is could go out with someone like me. I'm not a Chris Evans for anything, but I don't think I'm that bad looking. I told him it didn't matter and that she and I were getting married in a couple of months, so he needed to back off. He gave me a death look but didn't say anything. After an awkward silence, he left. After Arya had gotten back, I told her what went down. She asked me to describe him, and after I told her what he looked like, she said that was the same guy who came in before. She was a bit creeped out by what went down but found the fiancé excuse rather funny. She even stated she'd rather be engaged to me than go out with him, which I'm guessing was a compliment. A couple of weeks went by, and we had all but forgotten about the man. At this point, one night after it had gotten dark, Arya and I were getting the trash together so we could close down the registers and go home. Just then, we heard a bang at the door, causing both of us to nearly jump out of our skins. It was the guy again. He had a wild look in his eyes as he kept his face pressed against the glass. "We're closed," I told him, but he insisted he needed to come in. Arya yelled again to tell him she's not interested and for him to go away and leave her alone. But he yelled that he's not here for her, he's here for me. He then says that if he can take out her husband, then she'd be all his. Based on that, he wanted to kill me. I told Arya to run to the manager's office and call the police, and I'd stay here and watch him. I won't lie though, I was pretty afraid to be in that tiny little area. If the guy was able to get in, he wasn't the biggest guy, but he could have had a weapon on him. Plus, the store doesn't allow us to have self-defense items on us, so I was on my own here. The guy then started ramming the sliding doors like he was crazy. The doors were rattling. I could have sworn they were going to come off their base. Just then, Arya came running back around the corner with a 2x4 in her hand, yelling that the cops were on their way. Finally, the man decided to leave. The closing manager met the officers when they came, and he took them to review the cameras. Thankfully, the man was caught and arrested, but Arya and I felt unsafe working there any longer. We're still friends and even attend the same college together, but we have separate jobs now while we pay our way through classes. I'm glad she was there to help me with the road man, as I hate to imagine what he might have done to me, or worse, what he might have done to her. She says she's glad I was there for her as well, as having a guy around tends to make men like him less confident in what they might try. It was a wake-up call for me as to how dangerous it can be for some girls when an interested guy just doesn't want to take no for an answer. During the summer last year, I chose not to take any classes and got a job at a gas station right next to my college campus. I was sort of disillusioned with school and wanted to make some money while I had time off. The gas station was one of the first places I tried applying to, and it turned out to be the last when they hired me on the spot. I thought it was a little weird, but I didn't question it. Unfortunately, they said they only wanted me for the night shift, which was from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I knew it would wreak havoc on my already messed up sleep schedule, but I decided to go for it and just see how it went. To my surprise, most of the time it wasn't that bad. The first few hours of the shift were pretty busy, and it would get crazy, but then it would always get really slow until about 5 o'clock in the morning. This gave me plenty of time to clean, stock the shelves, and chill out until the morning rush. Occasionally, somebody suspicious or problematic would wander in, but I never had anything get too out of hand. Well, that was of course until something did happen. It was a Thursday, which wasn't usually a busy night. I had a coworker until about midnight, then they went home, and I was left alone. Time went by pretty fast, and before I knew it, it was almost 2 a.m. That's around the time a man walked in, and I immediately had a bad feeling about him. He had a shaved head and a bunch of tattoos of weird symbols, so I was pretty sure he was a skinhead. I noticed he had parked his dirty old lifted pickup truck in the handicap spot too, but I didn't want to get on his case about it. It was 1:58 when he walked in, and he spent a few minutes wandering around the store. In the end, though, all he bought was a case of beer. However, by then it was 2:01. My county has a law that says alcohol can't be purchased between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. I told the man that, as politely and apologetically as I could, that he couldn't buy the beer. He immediately became agitated and went off on a rant about how it was a free country and that it was a stupid law. I tried my best to reason with him, and I said that I was just trying to do my job. But this only made him start to criticize me like I was some kind of spineless pawn for my boss. That's when I asked him to leave if he was going to be that way. Then he suddenly changed his tone again, acting all chummy and saying it wasn't a big deal and that I should bend the rules for just a few minutes since it was before 2 o'clock when he walked in. He kind of made a good point, so I eventually caved just so he would get out. I sold him the case of beer, and then, of course, he asked for a pack of cigarettes to go with it. I let him have it as there was no rule against tobacco sales. He smiled at me and then left the store. I breathed a sigh of relief, but that relief was short-lived. I thought he would get in his truck and leave, but instead, he opened the tailgate and sat down on the truck bed. He cracked open a can of beer and started drinking it. Now I had a feeling that this was far from over, and that was exactly the case. A few minutes later, another truck pulled up right next to his, and a couple of guys got out, both of them with shaved heads and tattoos. They stood around the back of the first guy's truck, just smoking and drinking. I knew I had to go out there and tell them that they couldn't loiter in front of the store and that it was illegal to drink out in the open like that, especially that close to a car. But I was a little scared already. They kept looking in the window at me, smirking as if they knew what I was thinking and were challenging me to try. Before I could find the courage, another car, this time an SUV, pulled in next to the two of them, and two more guys got out and joined the others. They were all part of the same skinhead group, without a doubt. My guess is they were coming from a bar that had just closed and didn't want to end the night yet. That was the most reasonable explanation, but my paranoid thoughts made me think they were about to get together and burn down the store because the owner's wife was Mexican. Then the first guy came back into the store. He was drunker than before and all smiles. But then he came back to the register with another case of beer. I was about to tell him he definitely couldn't buy it at that time, but before I could even open my mouth, he looked at me all smug and said he really wouldn't want to disappoint him and all of his friends. I took that as a pretty solid threat, so I let him do what he wanted. My hands were shaking, and I was dreading having to count change in front of him. But then he told me to keep the change, like he was giving me some kind of big tip. He walked back outside, and all the skinheads cheered at the fresh case of beer. Apparently, they had worked together and finished all 24 cans of the previous one. I then realized they had been tossing the empty cans all over the ground and kicking them around. It felt like I was completely stuck with these bricks, and I knew I would either get in trouble over it or get literally ganged up on and have any manner of horrible things done to me just for saying no to them. What normal person would see a bunch of drunk skinheads smoking cheap cigarettes on top of their pickup trucks in front of a store in the middle of the night and still want to walk past them to get in? Pretty much nobody, not a single person, except more of the skinheads. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked up and locked the door so they couldn't get back in. Then I walked back to the office and called the police. Several minutes later, a cruiser showed up and told them to screw off. There was some shouting outside that I couldn't quite make out, but I was worried for a few minutes that things would escalate. Thankfully, they left without causing too much of a scene, but I have no idea how close it got. The cop waited for them to leave before doing so himself. Right before he got on his way, I came out and asked him to stay a while I cleaned up their mess. The next day, I unfortunately had to quit that job. There was nothing more terrifying to me than the thought of being stuck behind that register if those guys ever decided to come back. Still, I kind of get worried that one of them will see me around town and recognize me. I don't know what those people are all capable of. All I know is my town is full of dudes like that, and they're always causing problems. I've been a night owl my whole life, so I work night shifts exclusively. I really don't work well with other people, whether they're my coworkers or not, so I picked a job I could do completely on my own. I became a nighttime janitor for my local school district after I graduated from high school. Schools have always had nightly cleaning as part of health codes in most areas, but obviously, in recent years, it's become much more important. My first job was in a fairly large K-12 school. There were a couple of daytime custodians as well, but at night it was just me and one other person splitting the school down the middle. My coworker and I barely ever interacted, which I appreciated a lot. Every single night, all the floors get mopped, vacuumed, every desk, table, and door handle is disinfected, and every toilet, urinal, and sink also gets cleaned. It takes a full 8-hour shift to accomplish, and for that entire time, I don't talk to a single person. It's great, honestly. Most of my coworkers are women, and they don't want me talking to them either. When I tell people about my job, a lot of them think the hardest part is cleaning up after the messes left by the students. For the most part, I guess they are right, but I always tell them I would rather plunge and clean 10 clogged and traumatized toilets every single night than ever have to work directly with another human being all day long, especially a horde of minors. These days, there's one example I give of why I say that. It was the night after Halloween. I came in for my usual shift and got started without even saying hello to my coworker. We started on opposite ends and met in the middle, so we would only see each other when we were finishing up. The first hour was mostly normal except for one obvious thing out of the ordinary. I always keep my music at a low volume on my headphones, but from outside them, I kept hearing things. Usually, all the other faculty are gone by 8 p.m., but sometimes there's somebody who stays late. I couldn't decide what I was hearing through my music, but I wasn't in the mood to turn it off, so I just ignored it. A little while later, I took a break from mopping to change the water in the bucket. I was gone for about 5 minutes, but on my way back to where I stopped, I walked past one of the hallways I had just mopped and noticed the wet floor sign had fallen over. For legal reasons, I had to step over the wet floor and stand it back up, then mop back over my tracks. Annoyed, I walked over to it but froze for a moment when something else caught my eye. There was another set of tracks in the water, leading to and from the sign. They were little footprints, something a kid would make. After I stood the sign back up, I followed the tracks, knowing I would have to mop over those too, basically redoing the whole hallway. The tracks ran all the way to the end, where there was a flight of stairs up to the second floor. From there, they dried up pretty quickly. I stormed up the stairs and got to the second floor, but nobody was there. I took my phone out of my pocket and paused my music so I would be able to hear if anyone was running around. Right as I looked down, I saw a flash of movement at the end of the hallway. I also heard a bunch of footsteps echoing across the empty school, so I started making my way to the end of the hall. By the time I got there, I still couldn't see anyone, but then I heard a little kid laughing. It felt like I was in a horror movie, but at that point, I was more annoyed than scared. I stood there looking around for a few seconds until I heard a crash from the first floor. I rushed downstairs and nearly flipped my lid when I saw the mop bucket I had just refilled was knocked over. The water was spilling everywhere in a huge pool. I absolutely swore my head off as I went back to the nearest janitor's closet for a dry mop and a bunch of towels. It took me half an hour to clean up that mess and then another 15 minutes to redo the hallway that got messed up, which meant my break was down to 15 minutes. However, I was so pissed off that I walked to the other side of the school and interrupted my coworker to ask if she had been messing with me. She looked completely dumbfounded and innocent. She asked if I was all right or needed any help, but to that, I just walked away. I set up again and got back to work. Another hour passed, and I managed to make up some lost progress. I was angrily powering through it, debating in my head the whole time about what I should do. I thought about reporting it to the school or maybe just calling the police myself, but in the end, I figured I would seem crazy to everyone, just like I did to my coworker, so nothing happened. Again, until 11 o'clock, out of nowhere, the lights shut off in the whole school. It was pitch black for about 3 seconds until the emergency lights turned on, giving everything a reddish hue. It came as a shock to me, and to be honest, I was worried. I tried to tell myself it was a malfunction or maybe some kids messing around, but my mind was going to all sorts of possibilities. I had keys to the electrical room where the light switches were, and I was the closest to it, so I stopped what I was doing and marched over. I was pissed off about losing more time and missing out on my entire break. But halfway there, something pushed those concerns out of my head. I heard the most blood-curdling scream of my life, the panic shriek of my coworker echoing endlessly. I stopped in my tracks, feeling like I had just been hit by an electric shock. Seconds later, I heard the sound of a door opening really loudly, like someone was ramming through it from the inside. I hoped it was my coworker escaping and not somebody else making their way into the school. I forced myself to keep going and finally made it to the electrical room. I was right outside the door trying to find the right key when I noticed that it was already cracked open. I pushed it open slowly, afraid of what I might see, and a shape appeared in front of me, standing unnaturally in the darkness. My blood ran cold. It could have been anyone. I gave up on trying to turn on the lights and instead reached over for my phone in my pocket. However, as soon as I moved, the figure bolted forward and slammed the door in my face. I cursed and jumped back, stumbling until my back hit the wall behind me. Once I regained my balance, I started running. I wanted to leave, but for once in my life, I thought about the well-being of somebody else and ran to the other side of the school to find my coworker. After checking a few of her hallways, I finally found her mop bucket sitting alone in the middle of the floor next to a bathroom. Without hesitation, I rushed over to it, hoping not to see any evidence that she had been hurt. Nothing seemed unusual except for the fact that she was nowhere to be found. I looked all around in the dim lighting, but as far as I could tell, I was alone. But not completely alone. The sound of a laughing child echoed in the distance again, striking fear into my chest. I clutched the handle of the mop, for lack of anything else to defend myself with, and lifted it out of the bucket, holding the end of the handle out like a spear. I faced the direction of the laughter, looking down the hallway so intently I got tunnel vision. In a moment of sheer terror, someone whispered, "Hello," into my ear. I turned around and, without thinking, jabbed the handle of the mop into their chest with all my might. I heard a grunt as the person who snuck up on me hit the ground and vomited only a second later. I shouted at them to tell me who they were, but then they started to cry. I could tell they were trying to hold it back, but they couldn't. Gradually, my eyes made out what I was looking at. It was a student kneeling on the floor. Suddenly, all my fear of danger was replaced with the fear of losing my job for hitting a student. However, as things shook out over the next few days, it turned out all right. Two twins in the 9th grade and their little brother got the idea to keep the spirit of Halloween going and prank the overnighters in the school by hiding in the lockers. There was one set of lockers in the whole building that wasn't in use and had no locks or ties on them, and those kids were skinny enough to fit in there and hide. After doing their after-school activities, they managed to avoid being expelled, probably from crying a lot. The school district understood my actions and let me keep my job, but I was transferred to a different school. All in all, this is why I don't like people, especially kids. Up until about a year ago, I worked at a grocery chain. I was, and still am, a working college student. My availability was only 6 p.m. to closing, which in this case was midnight. It wasn't my favorite job. I dealt with a lot of annoying customers and coworkers, one of whom once broke into my locker and put a used tampon in the pocket of my apron, but that's a whole different story. My job was walking distance from where I lived, which made it really convenient since I didn't have a car. One Friday night, I was closing as usual with my supervisor, and we were running later than we usually did. My supervisor and I finally got the remaining customers out of the store, clocked out, and left. I left before my supervisor and began walking home. After a long, frustrating day of annoying customers, it felt great to just walk through the fresh winter air. I spent a few minutes shuffling through my phone's playlist to find a song to walk home to. I had made my way down the main road, careful not to slip on any of the ice. One thing that's really important to know about me is that I'm a very anxious person, and while it's definitely a problem most of the time, it does help make me constantly aware of my surroundings. That's when I saw an approaching car slowing down on the deserted main road, and I automatically went on high alert. It was a black car that came to a slow stop against the sidewalk I was on, about 10 feet behind me. I immediately clutched my phone in my hand and brought it out of my pocket. If there wasn't any ice covering the sidewalk and my feet didn't hurt, I probably would have run. Instead, I opted to try and pretend that I wasn't afraid, which I don't think worked because I picked up my pace after the car stopped. It was then that I heard a man's voice call out to me. "Hey, it's cold out here. You want a ride?" the man said. I kept walking away from him up the street, pretending I didn't hear him and just hoping he would go away. It didn't work. A few moments later, I heard the car tires crushing the ice on the road and then turned around to see what he was doing. He was now driving with the car in reverse. When he caught up to me, he had rolled down the passenger seat window some more. He was a black man, maybe in his mid to late 30s. He looked at me and I stopped, prompting him to stop his car as well. "Hey, let me give you a ride," he said through the car window. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to be polite because even though I was scared, I tried to be rational. All he did was offer a girl a ride home who was walking in the cold at night. Also, with the possibility of him being a kidnapper or a rapist, it was really best not to piss him off on the empty street. "No thank you," I said politely but firmly that I hesitated for a second. I was trying to figure out what to say that would get him to leave me alone away which street I lived on. "I'm okay," I insisted. "Thanks, though." As I finished thanking him, I started walking again, now putting both headphones in with the song paused. It was more of a way to signal that I was done talking to him. He didn't say anything, but I knew that he was watching me walk away. I felt relieved when I got a few more feet away from his car and heard the sound of his tires driving away. Unfortunately, the situation was only getting worse. As I started walking past the entrance of a car dealership, I saw the same car making a U-turn in the middle of the street out of the corner of my eye. When I turned slightly, he pulled up to the sidewalk yet again, this time a few feet in front of me. The man then opened the driver's seat door and got out of the car. It was at that point I was actually afraid I wouldn't make it home that night. He looked at me with this weird expression on his face. He had this really focused look while trying to look casual. It's really hard to describe. He started walking up to me. This kind of situation had never happened to me before, but I always thought of dangerous hypothetical situations in my head. I guess thinking about those situations prepared me to an extent because before I even realized it, my phone was already against my ear like I was on the phone with someone, even though I wasn't. When he came closer to me, he saw my phone in my hand and must have realized someone could know where I am right now, or I could be calling 911. That's the only explanation I can think of because when he looked at my phone, his demeanor totally changed. He stopped in his tracks with a worried look on his face and then asked me, "Oh, are you on the phone with someone right now?" I replied, looking at him with my phone still against my face and my other hand casually in my pocket. Without saying anything else, the man immediately turned around, got back in his car, and then started to drive up the street. I walked slowly at first, letting some distance grow between us, but as soon as I felt safer, I walked up the street as fast as I could without slipping. I frantically tried to call my dad, who I thought was home at the time. He didn't pick up. I then tried to call my sister and my fiancé. I didn't feel like I was in danger anymore, but my adrenaline was through the roof and I wanted to hear from someone who would make me feel better. I gave up calling after I couldn't get in touch with anyone and just kept walking. I was finally getting ready to turn onto another street when I passed an empty parking lot and saw the same man leaning against his car looking over at me. "Hey," was all he said in a flat tone when I walked by. At this point, I was completely freaked out. I didn't have my phone out anymore, so I couldn't pretend I was talking to someone again, and I was also significantly closer to my house. If he decided to get into his car and follow me, there wasn't any detour I could take to try and lose him. I was now on the verge of tears, and that's when I decided to call 911. I called 911 and told them the situation. The officer on the other line stayed on the phone with me until I got into my house. After that, an officer came to my house and asked me a bunch of questions about the man. He also asked me about his car and where I last saw him. All of the details were either too vague or I didn't remember. He said that he would at least patrol the area for him. I'm not really sure if he actually did or not, but it made me feel better at the time. From that point, I needed a ride to and from work every shift until I got my schedule changed to day shifts. Just a few weeks later, the college semester ended and I was planning on skipping a semester anyway. That experience only reinforced my decision. The more I think about that situation, the more I realize how lucky I was. I was in the perfect position to be taken, but I actually used some quick thinking that really de-escalated the situation. I moved in with my fiancée, and now I have a pocket knife and pepper spray for whenever I walk home at night from my new job. It's something to remember. If you haven't called 911, if you don't have anything to defend yourself against someone, either let someone know where you are or pretend that they know where you are. It can potentially save your life. In the quaint town of Willowbrook, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, there was a house unlike any other. It stood at the edge of town, its weathered facade looming ominously over the neighborhood. Children whispered tales of its haunted past, claiming that the shadows within held secrets darker than the night itself. It was here that young grave digger spent his childhood, unaware of the horrors that awaited him within those walls. Grave was an inquisitive child, always eager to explore the world around him. His parents, both busy with work, often left him to his own devices, trusting the safety of their small town. One summer afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn, Grave found himself drawn to the mysterious house at the end of the street with a sense of curiosity that outweighed his fear. Grave pushed open the rusty gate and ventured into the overgrown yard. Weeds tangled around his ankles as he made his way to the front door, which creaked open with an eerie groan, as if welcoming him inside. The interior was shrouded in darkness, the only light filtering through dusty windows. Grave hesitated at the threshold, a chill creeping up his spine, but something compelled him forward, deeper into the belly of the house. As he stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the air grew thick with a sense of foreboding. Whispers echoed off the walls, faint and indistinct, like the murmurs of a long-forgotten past. Grave's heart raced in his chest as he followed the sound, drawn to a staircase that spiraled upwards into darkness. With each step, the whispers grew louder, forming words that sent shivers down Grave's spine. "Leave," they hissed, "before it's too late." But Grave pressed on, driven by a morbid curiosity that overpowered his fear. At the top of the stairs, he found himself in a narrow corridor lined with closed doors. The whispers seemed to emanate from behind one in particular, its wood warped and splintered with age. Summoning all his courage, Grave pushed open the door to reveal a room frozen in time. Dust-covered furniture lay scattered about, cobwebs clinging to every surface. But what caught Grave's attention was the figure huddled in the corner, its back turned to him. "Hello," Grave called out, his voice trembling. The figure remained motionless, its form shrouded in darkness. Grave took a tentative step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drew closer, he realized with horror that the figure was not human at all. It was a grotesque mannequin, its features contorted into a twisted mask of agony. In its outstretched hand, it held a faded photograph. Grave's hands shook as he took the photograph, his eyes widening in shock. It was a picture of a young boy, no older than himself, standing in front of the very house he now stood in. But what chilled him to the bone was the date on the back, the date of that very day, decades ago. Before he could comprehend the implications, The whispers around him grew deafening, a cacophony of anguished voices filling the room. "Help us," they moaned. "Free us from this place." Graves staggered back, his mind reeling with fear and confusion. Without a second thought, he turned and fled from the room, down the stairs, and out of the house. The echoes of the whispers haunted him every step of the way. When he emerged into the fading light of evening, he found himself in the overgrown yard once more. Gasping for breath, he stumbled towards the gate, desperate to escape the nightmare within. As he reached the gate, a sudden gust of wind slammed it shut with a resounding clang, sealing the house behind him. Grave looked back one last time, the house now looming like a dark specter against the twilight sky. From that day on, Grave avoided the house at the end of the street, the memory of the whispers and the haunting photograph etched into his mind forever. And though he grew up and left Willowbrook behind, he could never shake the feeling that something malevolent lingered within those walls, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim. To this day, the house remains untouched, a relic of a dark and tragic past. If you listen closely on quiet nights, you might just hear the whispers carried on the wind, a chilling reminder of the true stories that lie hidden within the shadows of childhoods long gone. As a child, my family lived in a sprawling old house with a basement that seemed to hold endless secrets. But it wasn't until one fateful night that I discovered the true horror lurking beneath our home. It was a stormy evening, and the wind howled outside as rain lashed against the windows. With the power out and the house plunged into darkness, my siblings and I huddled together in the living room, our hearts pounding with fear. But as the night wore on, an eerie sound began to echo through the house. A soft scratching coming from somewhere deep below. At first, we dismissed it as the sound of branches scraping against the windows, but as the scratching grew louder and more insistent, we knew something was terribly wrong. Summoning our courage, we ventured into the basement, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a sense of dread. As we descended the creaking stairs, the air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to press in around us like a suffocating blanket. But what we found waiting for us in the depths of the basement was far worse than anything we could have imagined. A creature hunched and twisted, its eyes gleaming with malice as it lurked in the shadows. With a scream of terror, we fled from the basement, the creature hot on our heels. As we reached the safety of the main floor, we slammed the door shut behind us, praying that whatever lurked below would never escape its dark prison. To this day, I can still hear the scratching coming from the basement, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lurk just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. And though we have long since moved away from that house, the memory of that night will haunt me forever, a reminder of the darkness that dwells within us all. Me and my 3 friends were in New York around Christmas time. We didn't finally decide to leave until about maybe 2 o'clock in the morning. We got on the first train that we could catch, and as expected, it was empty. We were pretty sobered up by then. Then there was a sudden commotion in the next car over. We had peeped through the glass in between the cars, and there were 2 hooded men, or maybe teenagers, standing obnoxiously close to a woman sitting in one of the seats who was screaming for help. I suggested that we go over and kick their asses, but as me and a buddy got a closer look, we saw they were armed with handguns. I pushed all my friends to get to the next car over, away from the armed men. I took a look back and saw one of the men pointing at us before starting to follow. We ran through at least 3 different cars with the men following us before the train finally stopped at the next station. We all booked it through the old station to the nearest place we could hide. I got separated from my friends, so I went to hide behind a garbage can. I could hear my chaser's shoes hitting the tiled floors, so I knew I had no time to find a better hiding spot. I peeked through the opening at the top of the bin. I could get a better look at them now. One was black, the other was Indian, and they were both really young looking. I was sure they were only trying to rob us until I heard one of them say, "If you find them, kill them." I hope you understand why I almost gave away my position in reaction to hearing this, with a gasp and almost pulling the garbage bin down with me as I returned to cover it. I consider it a miracle neither of them caught me. They left the area. I took notice that they didn't have their guns drawn at that moment. I ran in the opposite direction of the two and quickly caught my friends who were waving me over from behind a large pole. I took cover with them behind another pole not far from that one, and we waited for as long as we thought necessary. The big shock to the story, though, was when we caught a glimpse of the woman from the train, who we thought was being threatened by the two men, walking over in the direction of the men and then calling something along the lines of, "Where are they? Don't tell me you didn't get them." The two men reappeared from beyond a corner, walking over to the woman. The rest of what they said was too low to pick up on. They walked back down the stairs to the platforms and, as we could guess, waited for another train to run their trap again. At the very least, we called the police and reported what was going on, but I have no idea if they were ever caught.